It is 1943. It is early morning, somewhere in the middle of America, and she is already moving. The kitchen is not large. A gas range against one wall, white enamel with black iron grates, the pilot light a faint blue eye in the dark. A yellow curtain above the sink, the colour of weak sunlight, moving slightly in the draught from the window she cracked before bed because she likes to hear the night. A wooden table with 4 chairs, a calendar on the wall from the hardware store, a rooster on it. The date circled in pencil. Not this date, a future date, a date she's watching without letting herself watch it too closely. She moves the way people move when they're trying not to wake anyone, careful, practiced. The particular economy of someone who has learned to do everything quietly. She does not look at the calendar. The coffee percolates. The light through the window is not quite dawn yet, that particular grey that belongs to no hour, the hour before the hour. And she is already here, already in motion, already ahead of the day before the day has even begun. This is where we are tonight. Stay with me. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Let me tell you about the house. Not in a catalogue way, not as a list of its dimensions or the year it was built or what the real estate listing might have said. Let me tell you about it the way she knew it, by feel, by smell, by the particular sequence of sounds it made when you moved through it before anyone else was awake. The front door stuck slightly in winter. You had to push with your shoulder, and the sound it made when it gave was a sound she could have produced in her sleep. She had been making it for 6 years. The first winter after they moved in, she mentioned it to her husband and he said he would get to it, and the winter passed and then another winter came and the door still stuck and she stopped mentioning it and simply learned to push with her shoulder. Not bitterly, just practically. Some things you fix and some things you fold into your body and carry. The living room smelled of wool and the faint cedar of a hope chest her mother had given her, and the particular quiet of a room that was kept tidy but never quite pristine, because a house with children in it resists perfection with a cheerful stubbornness that eventually you come to admire. There was a rug, dark green, braided, made by her mother-in-law from old coats, and the legs of trousers that had worn through at the knees. Nothing was thrown away in those years. Nothing that could still be anything was allowed to become nothing. The console radio stood against the wall between the living room windows, substantial as a piece of furniture, which is what it was. A cabinet of dark walnut with a cloth grill on the front, and a dial that lit amber when it warmed up, and a tuning needle that swept in a slow arc across the frequencies like someone reading a map. She had dusted around it and polished it more Sundays than she could count. The children were not allowed to touch it without permission, which was a rule they violated with such consistent ingenuity that it had become a kind of family tradition, the violation and the catching, and the negotiated consequence. The radio was everything in 1943. I want you to understand this in a way that goes beyond the historical fact of it, because the word radio does not carry enough weight today. We use the word casually, one among many devices, something in the car or on your phone or playing in the background while you do something else. In 1943, the radio was not background. It was the centre. It was where the war lived. Every morning the news, every evening the news, and in between the programmes that organised the hours, Jack Benny on Sunday evenings, Fibber McGee and Molly on Tuesday nights, Lux Radio Theatre on Monday, the Andrews Sisters singing something bright and full of brass. Glenn Miller. Before Glenn Miller went to war himself, before his plane disappeared over the English Channel in December of 1944, and the music became something you listened to with a different feeling, the way all beautiful things acquired a different feeling during those years. She knew the radio schedule the way she knew the seasons. It was infrastructure. It was how the family located themselves in time, and how she filled the silence that would otherwise have grown too large to inhabit. The kitchen was the centre of the house in the way that the hearth had been the centre of houses for thousands of years before. The warm room, the working room, the room where everything important happened and where nothing was wasted. The gas range had changed cooking from what her grandmother had known. There was no wood to split, no fire to maintain, no ash to clean. The heat came from a dial and a click, and a low blue flame that you could adjust with a hand in the dark. But the centrality had not changed. The kitchen was still where the day began and ended, where decisions were made, where children perched on chairs and did homework at the table, while supper came together around them. I want to talk about the gas range specifically, because it deserves more attention than it usually gets in histories of this period. The transition from wood cook stoves to gas ranges had happened in most American urban and suburban homes in the 2 decades before the war, and it represented something more profound than a simple upgrade in technology. It represented a fundamentally different relationship between a woman and her kitchen. The wood cook stove demanded knowledge. It demanded an intuitive grasp of heat and burn rates and wood types and moisture content. It demanded morning labour, the clearing of ash, the laying of kindling, the deliberate building of the fire before anything else could happen. The gas range demanded something different. Not less knowledge, not less skill, but a different kind. Precision, control. The ability to replicate results exactly because the heat was now measured and adjustable in ways that wood fire never was. The women who cooked on gas ranges in the 1940s had not had them their whole lives. Most of them had grown up in houses with wood stoves. They had made the transition as adults, and many of them described the gas range with a specific kind of pride, not the pride of having something expensive, but the pride of competence in a new medium. I can do this. I have learned this. This is mine now. The range in this kitchen was a hot point. White enamel, 4 burners, a broiler drawer beneath the oven. She kept a cast iron skillet on the back left burner most mornings, because the cast iron held heat the way nothing else did, and she used it so often it never had a chance to go cold. The oven door seal was slightly imperfect. She had learned to compensate by rotating whatever was in there halfway through the baking time, turning the pan with a practiced flick of her wrist that cost her nothing because it had become reflex. There is something I find genuinely moving about this kind of knowledge. The knowledge that lives in the body rather than on paper, that passes through practice into reflex, that cannot be Googled or consulted, that exists only in the hands of the person who earned it through years of repetition. She knew this oven the way a musician knows a particular instrument, its idiosyncrasies and tendencies, where it ran hot and where it ran cool, what it needed to do its best work. The pantry was the room I think about most when I think about this house. Not the showroom, not the good china in the cabinet in the dining room. The pantry. Because the pantry was where her competence lived in its most visible form. It was a narrow room, just off the kitchen, with shelves on 3 walls running from floor to ceiling. And on those shelves, in the summer and fall after the garden had come in and the canning was done, were rows of glass jars. Quart jars and pint jars, their lids sealed and labelled in her handwriting. Tomatoes, green beans, corn, bread and butter pickles, peach preserves, apple butter, tomato sauce, stewed tomatoes. In the winter of 1943, with rationing in full effect, with red stamps for meat and dairy and blue stamps for processed foods and the constant arithmetic of the point system that governed every trip to the grocery store. In that winter, those jars of canned goods were not decoration. They were the reason the family ate well when their neighbours sometimes did not. They were the physical evidence of work done in August that was paying dividends in January. One year, she counted, she had put up, this is the term put up, which I love for its plainness and its accuracy, she had put up 412 jars, 412, in a single season, in her own kitchen on her own stove with her own 2 hands and the pressure canner that was the most important piece of equipment she owned. 412. There is a photograph I've seen of a pantry from this period, a farmhouse in Ohio. The photo taken in October after the canning season was finished, the shelves full from floor to ceiling. The woman who took the photograph wrote on the back of it simply, "Winter is taken care of." Winter is taken care of. I keep coming back to that phrase because it does something that no amount of historical description can quite do. It tells you what those jars meant. Not just food, not just calories and vitamins and the practical outcome of a summer's labour. They meant the thing that all genuine preparation means, the reduction of fear. Winter is coming, and I am ready for it. I have done the work. The shelves are full. The family will eat. Now let me tell you about something else in that house that you might not think about unless someone pointed it out to you. The bedrooms. They were small. In a typical American working class or middle class home of 1943, the master bedroom was perhaps 10 by 12 feet. The children shared rooms. 2 to a room was standard, 3 was not unusual. The beds were metal frames with inner spring mattresses, made each morning with a precision that was expected and practiced. Tight corners and smooth surfaces. The quilt or coverlet folded back at the same angle every day, because the habit of order in small spaces was not aesthetic preference. It was the practical management of a tight world. The bathroom, one bathroom in most of these houses, had a bathtub with claw feet or the more modern built-in kind, a pedestal sink, black and white hexagonal floor tiles. The medicine cabinet held aspirin, mercurochrome, a bottle of Vicks Vapo Rub, a tube of Ipana toothpaste, a strop razor. There was ivory soap on the edge of the sink, the white bar worn to a thin oval near the end of the week, replaced on Saturday. The smell of ivory soap in the morning, that particular clean, soapy non-smell that is really the absence of any competing perfume, is one of those sensory signatures of the era that people who grew up in those houses still remember decades later. The basement, if there was one, was utilitarian in a way that basements have since mostly ceased to be. It was not a recreation room or a media room or additional living space with carpet and recessed lighting. It was a working basement, a coal furnace or oil furnace, or in the better appointed homes a gas furnace, a wringer washing machine, a deep sink for laundry, shelving for overflow storage from the pantry, possibly a workshop area for whatever repairs the house required. In some houses, a root cellar behind the furnace room, a cool dark space with a dirt or concrete floor where potatoes and onions and winter squash and apples could be kept for months. The house was not large. It was not aspirational in the modern sense. Nobody looked at it and imagined what it could become with an open floor plan and new appliances. It was what it was, a working home, a place designed to shelter a family and support the labour that kept the family alive, and every room in it was organised around that function with a directness that I find, honestly, beautiful. I want to ask you something here, and I mean it genuinely, not as a rhetorical device. When you walk through your own home today, what do you see? I think for most of us the answer is a mix of function and aspiration. Rooms that work but also signal something about who we are or would like to be. Appliances that serve a purpose but also represent choices about the kind of person we imagine ourselves to be. In 1943 the home was not a statement. It was a tool. A very personal, very beloved tool maintained with enormous care, but not primarily a vehicle for self-expression. It was where the work of the family happened, and understanding that about the house helps you understand something essential about the woman who moved through it before anyone else was awake. She was not the curator of a home, she was the engine of one. The curtains she had made herself from fabric bought at the 5 and dime, sewn on a Singer treadle machine that had belonged to her mother and that she had carried to every house they had lived in through 3 moves. The rag rug in the entryway she had braided herself on winter evenings from fabric strips cut from clothes the children had outgrown. The quilt on the bed had been pieced from the same source, because nothing was wasted, because waste was a word that had a different weight in those years. And now it is before dawn on a morning in 1943, and she's already in the kitchen, and the coffee is already on, and the house around her holds everything she has made and maintained and managed and worried over and loved. The gas range clicks low. The percolator burbles softly in the dark. She's calculating. She's always calculating, but she does it the way people breathe, without thinking about the fact that she's doing it, because the math has been internalized past the point of conscious effort. How much coffee is left in the can? What the ration stamp situation is? Whether it is a Tuesday, because Tuesday is the day she does the washing, and she needs to account for that in everything else. The particular grey outside the kitchen window lightens almost imperceptibly toward the colour of pewter. Something about the way the day begins before anyone else is awake, the way a person can stand in the kitchen of their own house at 5 in the morning and feel the entire weight and texture of their life settle around them, with a quiet accuracy that the busy hours never allow. Something about that moment has not changed at all in the 80 years between her kitchen and yours. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you can feel that for a moment. The house around you, everything it holds, the fact that it is yours and you know it by feel. She pours the coffee, the cup warms both her hands. The day is about to begin. There is a detail about the 1940s American home that I keep coming back to when I think about this period, and it is one of those details that seems almost too small to matter until you sit with it for a while, and then it begins to expand in the way that genuinely meaningful things do, until it contains more than you expected. The kitchen floor. In most middle-class and working-class American homes of the 1940s, the kitchen floor was covered in linoleum. Not the designer linoleum of contemporary interiors, not the retro-chic vintage pattern selected for its aesthetic appeal. Just linoleum, practical, washable, relatively durable, available in a range of patterns that tried to suggest the ceramic tile that families who could afford ceramic tile would have had, and that was maintained with a waxing schedule that was itself a minor ongoing labour. She waxed the kitchen floor once a week. On her knees, with a cloth and a tin of Johnson's paste wax, working it in with a circular motion, buffing it by hand, because in 1943 an electric floor polisher was a luxury not available to this household even if the cord would have been long enough and the outlet correctly positioned, which it was not. The floor, when properly waxed, had a specific shine to it that she could assess with a glance, the particular reflection of the kitchen window light that told her the job had been done properly. This is the kind of work that is easy to overlook in a history of this period because it is not dramatic, because it does not connect, obviously, to the war, or the rationing, or any of the larger events of the moment. It is just a floor, just the weekly maintenance of a surface that exists to be walked on. But here is what the floor waxing was, in the context of a household that was being run under wartime conditions, by a woman who was managing everything alone. It was an act of maintenance and continuity. The choice to keep the floor waxed, to keep the house in the condition it would be in if everything were ordinary, was itself a refusal of the extraordinary circumstances. She was not going to let the house go. She was not going to let the standards slip, not because anyone was watching, not because anyone would notice or credit her for it, but because maintaining the ordinary things was itself a form of faith. A statement about the kind of life she expected to be living when the war was over and he was home. The floor would be waxed when he returned. This is not self-deception. It is not performance. It is the domestic equivalent of the soldier keeping his equipment in order, not because a battle is happening today, but because readiness is a practice that must be maintained through the quiet days so that it is present when it is needed. Let me tell you about the living room in a little more detail, because the living room of a 1940s American home had a social function that has changed substantially since that period. And understanding that function helps clarify what the house was for and what the woman who maintained it understood about her role. The living room was the room in which the family was presented to the world. It was the room that company saw, that neighbours were brought into for coffee, that was used for the small social events, the birthday gatherings, the Red Cross chapter meeting rotated among households, the rare visits from relatives. It was kept cleaner than the other rooms. The furniture in it was the best furniture, often purchased on instalment, the sofa and the 2 armchairs and the coffee table, the china cabinet in the corner with the dishes she used only for company, and the small accumulated objects that constituted the family's aesthetic life. A pottery bowl, a photograph in a frame, a decorative lamp. The living room rug was vacuumed on Saturdays. The Hoover vacuum cleaner, acquired through several years of small savings, was one of the household's genuinely modern conveniences, the machine that had transformed a task that had previously required carrying rugs outdoors and beating them into something that could be accomplished in the room itself in 20 minutes. She had opinions about the Hoover, specifically about the bag, which clogged at predictable intervals and needed to be cleaned out in the basement to avoid spreading dust through the house. She had worked out a procedure for this that minimised the mess. She had worked out a procedure for everything that minimised the mess. The bathroom was cleaned on Saturdays as well, the same day as the vacuuming, the morning of the week set aside for the more intensive work that did not happen daily. She scrubbed the tub with Bon Ami and the toilet with a brush and the sink with a cloth, following a sequence she had developed that minimised the amount of cleaning solution she used because cleaning supplies cost money, and she was not wasteful of anything that cost money. The bedrooms were made every morning without exception. The bed-making was not a rule anyone imposed on her. It was a standard she imposed on herself, a conviction that the day could not properly begin until the beds were made, that an unmade bed represented something unfinished about the morning that coloured everything that followed. She had made the older children's beds until they were old enough to make their own, at which point she had taught them and required it of them with the matter-of-fact expectation of someone who understands that children need structure and that structure requires consistent enforcement. The standard for the children's bed-making was lower than her own, but higher than they would have set for themselves. This is the particular art of managing children's household contributions. calibrating the expectation to something above their instinctive minimum but below perfection, because perfection is discouraging and the minimum teaches nothing. The basement. She went to the basement every Monday for the washing. The wringer washer stood in the centre of the basement connected to the cold water tap, filled by the hose, heated with a heating element and equipped with the wringer, 2 rubber rollers that the wet laundry was fed through, pressing out the water which then drained back into the tub. The process was, sort by colour and soil level, wash the whites first in the hottest water, then the light colours, then the darks. Each load went through the washer and then through 2 rinse tubs set up alongside, then through the wringer into the basket, then up the basement stairs and out to the clothesline in the backyard, where the laundry was hung in a specific order, sheets and towels on the outer lines where they would get the most sun, shirts and blouses inside them, small items on the innermost line. In winter, the laundry could not be hung outside in the coldest weeks, and the basement became the drying room, with lines strung across it, and the furnace running, and the laundry going stiff in the heated air until it was dry. Shirts dried this way had a slightly different quality than shirts dried in the sun. Stiffer, sometimes slightly musty if the drying took too long. And she managed this by opening the small basement window to circulate air and by adding a small amount of bluing to the whitewash, the product that had been sold to American housewives since the 19th century, to counteract the yellowing that hot water and soap produced in white cotton. Bluing. Bluing is one of those product categories that has almost entirely disappeared from modern domestic life, replaced by the optical brighteners added to modern laundry detergents, and when I come across references to it in household accounts of the period, it produces in me a kind of vertigo of the historical imagination, the recognition of how many layers of practical knowledge have been lost because they were not written down, not considered worth preserving, too ordinary to record. She ironed on Tuesday. The ironing board was kept in the bedroom closet and brought out to the kitchen on Tuesday mornings. The iron was a steam iron, one of the real modern conveniences of the era, which used a water reservoir to produce steam that relaxed the fabric and made pressing easier than the dry iron of her mother's time. She ironed his shirts, the ones he'd taken overseas, the ones she had been ironing anyway so they would be ready when he returned. And she ironed the children's school clothes and her own blouses and the kitchen curtains when they came off the line. Ironing takes time. Not creative time, not planning time, but steady useful time, the same quality as mending, the kind of work that leaves the hands occupied and the mind available, the radio playing in the background, the steam rising from the iron with its particular clean hot smell. She ironed his shirts on Tuesday. She ironed them carefully, the way she had always done, with the collar first and then the shoulders and then the sleeves and then the front placket and then the body of the shirt, folded and stacked and ready for whenever he came home. This is a thing she has never told anyone, that she kept ironing his shirts throughout his absence, that the ironing of his shirts on Tuesday mornings was one of the practices by which she maintained faith in the future she expected. If she stopped ironing his shirts, she would be admitting something that she was not willing to admit. So she ironed them, and folded them, and stacked them on his shelf, where they were waiting for him. I want to spend a moment with the windows of this house, because windows in 1943 were not simply architectural features, but functional elements that required management. In winter, the windows sweated. This is the technical term, the moisture in the warm interior air condensing on the cold glass and running down the sill, pooling there in a thin bead of water that, if left unattended, would rot the wood beneath the paint over years and require eventually a more serious intervention. She wiped the window sills on cold mornings. This was a 2-minute task, unremarkable, invisible, part of the routine of maintaining the house that happened automatically without being decided, the way brushing teeth happens. In summer, the windows were the primary technology of cooling. There was no air conditioning. The management of the house's temperature on a hot day was accomplished through the strategic opening and closing of windows, catching the cross-ventilation that moved through the house when the prevailing breeze was right, closing the south-facing windows in the morning to keep the cool night air in, and opening the east and west windows to create movement. She knew the house's ventilation patterns the way she knew the oven, intuitively from experience, from the accumulated observation of many summers. The blackout curtains were a wartime addition. Heavy dark fabric, purchased in the fall of 1942 when the Civil Defence Regulations required their installation, hung on tracks inside the regular curtains so they could be drawn at nightfall without replacing the normal window treatments. She had installed them herself, following the instructions in the civil defence pamphlet, and they worked. No light escaped from the house after dark when the blackouts were drawn, which was the requirement, and which she met with the same seriousness she brought to every requirement that the wartime period imposed. The blackout curtains were one of those daily reminders of the war's presence in the house, the physical evidence of a threat that was not theoretical, but that was also not immediate, not really, not here in this inland city, but present enough to justify the precaution and to shape the evening's ritual of drawing the curtains as darkness fell. She drew them every evening. She opened them every morning. This happened so regularly that it became like breathing. She would have noticed the absence of the ritual more than its presence. The house in its physical details was a record of the years she had lived in it, the accumulated minor improvements and accumulated minor deteriorations that constitute a house's life alongside its human inhabitants. The paint in the kitchen had been refreshed twice. The bedroom wallpaper, a pale striped pattern that had been there when they moved in, was developing a crack along the ceiling edge that she monitored but had not yet addressed. The basement stairs had a railing she had installed herself, with help from Mr. Kelsey next door, when she had slipped once on the unrailed stairs while carrying the laundry basket. That railing was one of the small physical facts of her management, a problem identified, a solution implemented, a hazard eliminated before it became a crisis, the same management she applied to everything. The attic was used for storage, because attics were used for storage in those houses, not as finished living space. The Christmas decorations were up there, in labelled boxes, along with the children's outgrown clothes that had been saved in case they were needed again, the fabric remnants that might become something eventually, the old shoes that were not quite ready for the rag and bone man, the papers and documents and small accumulations of a family's life that needed keeping but not constant access. She went to the attic twice a year, once in December to bring down the Christmas boxes, once in January to put them back. The attic smelled of old wood and the particular faint dustiness of stored fabric, and in the summer it was very hot. So hot that standing up there in August was briefly disorienting, the heat a solid thing. In winter it was very cold, the insulation inadequate between the attic floor and the sky above the unheated space. She knew the house in all of its temperatures. The first hour of the morning belongs to her. Not by arrangement or agreement, not because anyone gave it to her or decided she deserved it, simply because she is the first one up and the house is quiet, and in that quiet she has the thing she will not have again until this time tomorrow, time that belongs entirely to herself. She does not waste it. This is important to understand. When I say the hour belongs to her, I do not mean she sits with her coffee and gazes dreamily out the window with a particular soft unfocus of leisure. I mean that the hour belongs to her in the way that any working hour belongs to the person doing the work, with full presence, full attention, the satisfaction that comes from uninterrupted competence. She uses it. The first thing she does every morning is the planning. Not the planning of a woman who keeps a planner or a calendar app or a project management system, the planning of a woman who carries the entire operational matrix of a household in her head and reviews it each morning the way a pilot reviews a checklist before takeoff. What needs to happen today? What cannot be deferred? What can be moved? What the ration book looks like? What she has in the pantry? What the children need before school? What her husband needs before work? What the house needs before it can be lived in with any degree of dignity? Rationing had been in effect since January of 1942. By the spring of 1943, every housewife in America had spent more than a year learning a new language, the language of points and stamps and OPA regulations, and the particular arithmetic of making everything stretch without making it obviously thin. The Office of Price Administration, the OPA, had developed a system that was, in theory, elegantly fair. Every American received a ration book. The ration book contained stamps. Each stamp was worth a certain number of points. Each product in the grocery store had a point value. You could buy what you could afford in stamps, and the stamps were meant to distribute scarce goods equitably across the population, so that no family's money could buy more than their share of the nation's supply. In theory. In practice, the system was a full-time occupation for the women who ran the grocery buying for their families. The blue stamps in Book 4 covered processed foods, canned goods, frozen foods, dried fruits. The red stamps covered meat, fish, butter, cheese, and oils. The point values changed monthly, sometimes weekly, as supply conditions shifted and the OPA recalibrated. A product that cost 12 points in March might cost 8 points in April, and then 15 points in May. Keeping track required attention and flexibility, and a willingness to plan ahead that most of us today would find exhausting. I want to give you a sense of what the actual numbers looked like. In 1943, the typical American household received 48 points per month per person in blue stamps and 64 points per month per person in red stamps. A pound of ground beef cost 7 red points. Butter was 16 red points per pound. A can of tomato soup was 2 blue points. A 1-pound can of tuna was 12 blue points. A pound of processed cheese was 8 red points. If you had 2 adults and 2 children in your household, you had a combined monthly budget of 312 blue points and 448 red points. That sounds like plenty until you start working out what it actually buys and realize that the choices you make in the first week of the month cascade through the remaining 3 weeks in ways that cannot be undone. She had learned to think in ration points the way she thought in cents, not as an imposition, but as a given, the terms of the problem you were solving. The morning planning session, which nobody would have called a planning session because it had no name and was not considered remarkable, began with the ration book and ended with a grocery list and a menu for the week that accounted for every constraint simultaneously: what was available, what she had stamps for, what the children would actually eat, what would constitute enough protein to keep a working man functional, what could be stretched with vegetables from the garden or preserved goods from the pantry, and what she could make from scratch that she could not afford to buy already made. These were not small calculations, and she made them every morning before the children were up, before her husband was dressed, before the house had made its first noise. There is a moment in the morning, for people who rise early, when the silence has a particular quality that is different from the silence of very late at night. Late-night silence is the silence of things finished, of the world having done what it was going to do for the day and settled. Early morning silence is the silence of potential, of everything not yet set in motion, the day still in its unmanifest state, everything possible that has not yet become actual. People who know this silence value it in ways that are hard to explain to people who have never experienced it. She had experienced it for years, and I think, though she would not have used this language for it, she drew something essential from it, not just the practical utility of uninterrupted planning time, but something more interior than that, a sense of agency in the quiet, the feeling of being ahead. After the planning, the breakfast. The wartime breakfast was a particular institution, shaped by the same rationing constraints as every other meal, but with the additional pressure of time. A household that needed to be ready to move out the door by 7:30 had about an hour to get everyone fed, dressed and functional, and the breakfast was therefore required to be both adequate and fast. Eggs, when there were eggs, which there almost always were because eggs were not rationed. This is one of those wartime details that surprises people. Eggs were not rationed under the OPA system, nor were fresh fruits and vegetables, chicken and other poultry, or fish not classified as processed. The rationing concentrated on the commodities that were genuinely scarce due to military demand: butter, sugar, meat, canned goods. But the things that were not rationed still required planning, because they were not unlimited either. She kept 3 hens in the backyard, which was common in those years. The Victory Garden movement had encouraged not just vegetable growing, but the keeping of small numbers of laying hens, and in neighborhoods across America, the gentle presence of hens in the backyard was a commonplace feature of the domestic landscape from 1942 onward. 3 hens in a good laying period could produce 2 to 3 eggs a day, which was usually enough, and when it was not, eggs were available at the grocery store. But prices fluctuated with supply, and every cent spent on eggs was a cent not available for something else. The breakfast she made varied with what was available and what the week's resources looked like. On the best mornings, scrambled eggs and toast with a scraping of butter, or, increasingly as the war went on, a scraping of oleo, the margarine that had come to replace butter in most households during the rationing years. Oleo came in white bricks, colourless because dairy industry lobbying had long prevented margarine manufacturers from adding the yellow colouring that would have made it look more like butter. But in 1943, the regulations were changing state by state, and some households were getting oleo that was already yellow, and others were getting white bricks with a little capsule of the yellow dye to be kneaded in at home, which the children loved to do and which she allowed because it kept them occupied, and the result was the same either way. On harder mornings, when the eggs were running low or the butter stamps were spent, it was oatmeal or cream of wheat, cooked in a double boiler on the back burner while the front burner held the percolator. The kitchen a small orchestration of simultaneous processes that she managed without apparent effort because by 1943 she'd been doing it for years. The coffee. I want to talk about the coffee for a moment because the coffee is one of those wartime details that tells a disproportionately large story. Coffee was rationed from November 1942 onward. Each person over the age of 15 received 1 pound of coffee every 5 weeks. 1 pound every 5 weeks. In an era when coffee was not merely the preferred morning beverage, but was effectively the only morning beverage, tea was available but was not culturally central in most American households the way it was in Britain. The rationing of coffee was not a minor inconvenience. It was a recalibration of daily life. She had responded to this the way she responded to every constraint, with careful management and zero self-pity. The coffee was measured with precision each morning. The percolator was run once and the grounds kept because a second, weaker pot could be made from used grounds in a pinch. She had experimented with coffee extenders, roasted grain products that could be added to stretch the actual coffee further, and had arrived at a ratio that her husband did not actively object to, which was the standard she applied. He was not a difficult man, that should be said. He worked at the factory. Since the war conversion, it was making parts for aircraft engines, something he was not permitted to discuss in any specificity. And he worked long hours and came home tired in the particular way that physical labour in a loud industrial environment produces, a tiredness that had a texture to it, a weight, and that required the specific medicine of a hot meal and a quiet first 15 minutes in the armchair before he could become conversational again. She had learned this about him over years, and she accommodated it without resentment, because it seemed to her simply part of knowing a person, the way you learn what a person needs before they know how to ask for it. She had her coffee alone in the kitchen before anyone else was up. She drank it standing, leaning against the counter, looking out the window at the backyard, the garden beds visible in the gathering light, the chicken wire of the small coop where the hens were already moving, the maple tree at the back of the lot that she had planted the second year. They were here from a sapling she had carried home from the hardware store on the bus, holding it across her lap with a small canvas sack of potting soil on the seat beside her. The maple tree was now 15 feet tall. In October it went the colour of something burning. She could see it from the kitchen window when she washed dishes, and it was one of those pleasures that she had never stopped noticing. The tree she had planted, the thing she had made that was bigger than she was now, growing still. The children came down one by one, the way children do, the youngest first because she woke loudly and the house responded to her, the older two drawn from sleep by the sounds of life already happening. They came to the kitchen in their nightclothes, hair unbrushed, faces soft with recent sleep, and she gave them each a cup of cocoa. The real cocoa was rationed, but she stretched it with a small amount of postum, the grain-based coffee substitute that she herself did not like, but that the children accepted without complaint because it was warm and sweet, and it was what mornings offered. The morning routine for two children getting ready for school in 1943 had a shape to it that was both universal and specific. Universal because children in every era of history have needed to be levered out of comfort and into readiness, with a combination of encouragement and light pressure that is one of the great continuous acts of parenthood. Specific because the particular mechanics of those mornings, the lunch boxes, the bobby socks, the hair ribbons, the penny loafers, the book bags, these details are so embedded in a particular moment in time that they constitute a kind of archaeology. The lunchbox was a metal box, lithographed in a cheerful pattern, and it held a waxed paper-wrapped sandwich, usually peanut butter because peanut butter used no ration stamps, an apple or whatever fruit was available, and a small container of milk. The sandwich was made fresh each morning because there was no other way. No refrigerated section of the grocery store packed with individual meal kits, no freezer meals designed for school lunches. You made the lunch that morning from what you had, and you made it so that it would survive 4 hours in a metal box in a coat room without spoiling. Peanut butter. Let me say a word about peanut butter. Peanut butter was one of the small miracles of the wartime kitchen, and I use the word miracle with intention, because in the context of rationing and scarcity, a food that was affordable, nourishing, protein-rich, widely available, required no ration stamps, and that children reliably ate without complaint was not a given. It was a gift. American housewives knew it. The consumption of peanut butter in the United States rose dramatically during the war years, and it never came back down. The post-war American relationship with peanut butter, the assumption that every household has a jar, that children will eat it, that it is a default option rather than a choice. This was forged in the kitchens of the 1940s by women who learned to count on it. By the time the school-aged children were out the door, backpacks on, lunchboxes in hand, the kitchen had already been used and partially cleaned, and was in the process of being reset for the next phase of the day. The youngest was still at home, not yet school age, or sometimes there was a shift where one child was home and two were at school, and the social arithmetic of the day changed accordingly. The husband was on his way out, coffee in one hand, hat on, the particular sound of the front door with its stuck hinge. And then the house was quiet again, in the different way that houses are quiet after the morning's departures, not the potential silence of before dawn, but the settled silence of tasks accomplished and the next phase not yet begun. The morning light was in the kitchen windows now, actual light, the yellow curtain translucent, the maple tree visible in the backyard. She poured the last of the coffee, stood at the window. In a house that was not large and not aspirational, but was entirely and completely hers. Let me tell you about the children's school morning in a little more detail, because the management of children getting ready for school is one of those universally recognized experiences of parenthood that has a timeless quality. The resistance, the lost shoe, the unbrushed hair. But that was also specific to 1943 in ways that are worth understanding. The older child, who was 9, was required to be at school by 8:15. This required departure from the house by 8 o'clock, which required being dressed, fed, with the lunchbox packed and the book bag assembled, and the permission slip signed if there was a permission slip by 7:50. The window between the 5 o'clock rising and the 8 o'clock departure was therefore the critical logistical period of the morning, the time in which all of the preparation for the day had to happen simultaneously and without error. The child did not always cooperate. This is the foundational truth of managing children through any time constraint, and it applied in 1943 as it applies today, and as it has applied in every era in which there were children and times that had to be kept. Some mornings the child was ready early, dressed and at the breakfast table with time to spare, reading a library book, consuming scrambled eggs with the efficiency of someone who understands the social contract of the morning and is committed to upholding it. Other mornings, and the frequency of these other mornings was roughly equal to the cooperative ones. The child had decided that a particular pair of socks was the only acceptable pair, and the pair in question was in the laundry, or had developed a strong opinion about a detail of the day's outfit that she herself would have to override, or was simply moving slowly in the particular way of children who have not yet decided to commit to the morning. She handled this with patience that was sometimes easier and sometimes harder than she made it look. The patience was not the patience of someone with unlimited reserves. It was the practiced patience of someone who has learned to identify which confrontations are worth having and which are not, which battles will use up emotional energy that is needed elsewhere and which can be resolved with a small tactical concession that costs nothing important. The socks she replaced with a different acceptable pair and said nothing more about it. The opinion about the outfit she listened to and partially accommodated where possible. The slow morning she addressed by building extra time into the schedule through earlier rising, which meant her own rising was adjusted to absorb the child's unpredictability. This is management. This is the daily practice of managing a system with variables you do not control, and doing it in a way that preserves the function of the system without producing unnecessary friction. It does not have a glamorous name, and it does not appear on any resume, and it does not get credited in any accounting of competencies. But it is one of the most demanding forms of practical intelligence I know of, and she practiced it every day. The walk to school, on the morning she walked with the children rather than sending them alone, which in 1943 was not unusual. Children of 9 and 7 were commonly sent short distances alone, the safety considerations of that era being different from ours, was the time for the multiplication tables, also for whatever the children needed to talk about, which varied day by day and which she listened to with the same quality of attention she gave to everything, the complete present tense focus of someone who has decided that whatever is in front of her is what deserves her full presence. This kind of attention, undivided and ungrudging, was one of the things she gave the children that they would not articulate or value until they were adults, and had tried to give the same thing to their own children, and discovered how difficult it was, how constantly the mind pulls away toward the other things on the list, how rare it is to have someone's complete attention, and how much it matters when you do. She listened to them. She listened to what they said and also to what they meant, and to the difference between the two, because children are not always expert at saying directly what they need, and the gap between what they say and what they mean is the gap that a present and attentive parent learns to read. She read it. She'd been reading it for years. On the walk to school, past the houses of the block with their vegetable gardens and their service flags, past the corner where old Mr. Whittaker always swept his sidewalk in the morning, past the bakery where the bread smell reached them half a block away, and the children always noted it with a reverence that she found genuinely funny. She held the younger one's hand and kept track of the older one with her peripheral vision, and asked about the fractions they were working on, and listened to the story about what Sarah had said at lunch yesterday and kept all of it in the foreground, while simultaneously running the afternoon schedule in the background. By the time she walked back alone, the house quiet, the kitchen needing its second visit of the day, the planning she had done before dawn had resolved into a schedule, and the schedule was running, and the day had its shape. She made the beds, she cleaned the kitchen properly, she put the laundry on if it was Monday, or started the bread if it was Wednesday, or began the accounting of the ration books if it was the end of the month and she needed to see where they stood. And she did it all in the quiet house with only her own company and the radio, and she was not lonely. This is worth saying clearly. She was not lonely in the house alone during the day. She was occupied. She was purposeful. She was the engine of a household that required management, and she was managing it. And this work, unglamorous and unacknowledged and invisible to almost everyone, was the thing she was genuinely good at. The house was the domain of her competence, and she inhabited it with the ease of someone who has found the place where their skills are useful. Not always, not every day. Some days the house felt small and the work felt repetitive and the aloneness felt like a weight rather than a preference. Some days she stood at the kitchen window long after she needed to, and let herself feel the size of the weight. These days were real and she did not pretend they were not. But mostly she worked, and the work was real, and the house was real, and the children were real, and the husband was real in his absence, and the jar of tomatoes in the pantry was the direct result of her effort, and would become the tomato soup that the children ate in November, and that was enough. That was enough to hold on to. Here is a question that I want you to sit with before I try to answer it. What would you do if every week you had to feed 4 people on a budget that was not just financial, not just a certain number of dollars, but was simultaneously financial and caloric and nutritional and regulated and uncertain, where the regulations could change between one week and the next, where the products you had planned to buy might not be available when you arrived at the store, where every choice you made on Monday had direct consequences for Thursday's dinner, and where the standard you were being held to was not just adequate but warm, served on time, eaten with thanks, and ideally the kind of thing that made the people at the table feel cared for. Because that was the practical reality of running a household kitchen under the OPA rationing system. Not in an abstract historical way, in the specific daily, no days off way that people who actually lived it knew from the inside. I want to walk you through a week in this kitchen. Not a dramatic week, not a crisis week, just an ordinary week in 1943. I want you to feel the texture of the problem she was solving, because I think it is one of the most underappreciated intellectual and logistical achievements in the history of American domestic life. It is Monday morning. She has her ration book, her grocery money, her knowledge of the pantry inventory, and the menu she planned over coffee this morning. She's going to the grocery store. The grocery store in 1943 was not the experience you have today. Let me be specific about what was different. The shelves were not always full. When word got out that a particular item, canned salmon for instance, or a certain brand of canned tomatoes, was in stock at a particular store, women lined up. sometimes before the store opened. The ration system was designed to prevent hoarding, and it largely succeeded, but scarcity was real, and the ability to plan a menu for the week depended not just on what you had stamps for, but on what was actually available when you arrived. The grocery store itself was a smaller institution. The supermarket format was still relatively new in the 1940s. The great chain stores like A&P and Kroger and Safeway were well established, but the scale was different. There was no warehouse club bulk purchasing. There was no prepared food section. There was no sushi counter or olive bar or station where someone would grill your salmon while you waited. There was a meat counter with a butcher behind it, a produce section, a canned goods section, a dairy section. That was roughly the extent of it. She walked through with a practiced eye. The meat counter. This was the central negotiation of the wartime grocery trip. Red stamps, which covered meat as well as butter and cheese and oils, were always in shortest supply relative to the family's protein needs. A pound of ground beef at 7 red points was reasonably economical. A beef roast at a higher point value was a weekend luxury, justifiable when it could anchor 2 or 3 additional meals. The roast on Sunday, the sliced cold meat on Monday, the soup made from the bones on Tuesday. This is the part of wartime cooking that I think reveals the most about what these women understood that we have partially lost, the concept of the transitional meal. The idea that a piece of meat was not just one meal, but the beginning of a sequence, each iteration using a little more of what the previous one had established, nothing wasted, the full nutritional and economic value of every purchase extracted across multiple days. A beef roast. She's looking at the roast behind the glass. She buys it. It is not cheap in stamps or in money. She knows exactly what she's going to do with it. Sunday, the roast. Roasted with the last of the root vegetables from the root cellar, carrots and potatoes and onions. A gravy from the drippings, because there is no better use of drippings than gravy, and she makes gravy the way her mother taught her. Not from a packet, not from a jar, from drippings and flour and the liquid from the roasting pan and whatever stock she has on hand. Adjusted by taste until it tastes the way gravy is supposed to taste, which she can identify instantly and without a recipe because the knowledge is in her hands. Monday. The cold sliced meat from the roast, arranged on a plate with bread and mustard and whatever pickles she has put up, alongside a pot of bean soup she has had simmering since morning. The bean soup is not a backup plan or a secondary option. It is a full meal. She makes it with the ham hock she's been saving, navy beans soaked overnight, onion and celery and bay leaves from the garden, salt and pepper. The beans cook down to something thick and fragrant that fills the kitchen, with a smell that the children will remember 40 years later and be unable to fully explain to their own children. Tuesday. The bones from the roast, simmered since Monday evening into a stock that is golden and clear and full of gelatin from the marrow. This stock is the mother of the week's cooking. It will go into the vegetable soup on Wednesday, into the sauce for Thursday's chicken, into the rice she makes on Friday. The stock costs nothing but time and attention, and she has both, and she uses them. Wednesday. Vegetable soup made with the stock and the last of the canned tomatoes from the pantry, with whatever vegetables are available from the store and whatever she has left from the garden. In winter, this might be potatoes and canned corn and green beans from her own shelves. With bread, this is a full dinner. She makes the bread herself. This is not a choice between making bread and buying bread. In many parts of the country in 1943, making bread is simply the cheaper and more practical option, and she's practiced at it. And the bread she makes is better than anything she can buy because she has been making it for years. And she knows this dough the way she knows the oven's idiosyncrasies, by feel, by the texture under her hands, by the way it sounds when she thumps the finished loaf. The bread is whole wheat because the government is running a nutrition campaign encouraging the switch from white bread to whole wheat. And she is persuadable on this because it makes sense to her, and because the whole wheat flour is more economical, and because she has read the pamphlets the Department of Agriculture is sending out, and she takes them seriously. She takes the government pamphlets seriously as a general matter, the extension service publications on canning, the nutrition guides, the OPA publications on stretching the food budget. She reads them and she uses them, and she regards the government in those years as a reasonable partner in the project of getting her family through the war. This is something that is easy to underestimate about the culture of this era. The degree to which ordinary American households, and specifically the women running those households, understood themselves to be participants in the war effort through their domestic choices, buying war bonds, growing victory gardens, conserving fat for glycerin production, participating in scrap drives. These were not reluctant concessions to government pressure. They were expressions of a genuine sense of shared purpose that we have difficulty imagining today from the inside, but that was, by almost all accounts of the period, real. She saves fat. I mention this specifically because it is one of those wartime practices that modern people find slightly bewildering and that turned out to be genuinely important. Kitchen fats, the rendered drippings from bacon, the fat from any cooked meat, the grease from the frying pan, were collected in tin cans and turned into the local butcher or collection point, from which they were processed into glycerin for use in manufacturing explosives. The Office of War Information ran campaigns explaining this to American housewives, and the housewives responded. By mid-1943, American kitchens were turning in millions of pounds of salvaged fat per month. She kept a tin can on the back of the stove specifically for this purpose. Every time she cooked anything with fat, she poured the cooled drippings into the can. When the can was full, she took it to the butcher down the street, who paid her 4 cents a pound for it, and forwarded it to the collection system. 4 cents a pound is not nothing in 1943. It is a small thing in terms of money, and a large thing in terms of what it represents, the integration of the domestic kitchen into the war effort in a literal physical way, the fat from her frying pan becoming something that would fire something that would, in some chain of causation she could not follow all the way to its end, contribute to winning the war. I find this remarkable. I find it remarkable in the way that I find all of the genuine connections between the domestic and the historical remarkable. The moments when the private world of the kitchen and the public world of events intersect in ways that are usually invisible, but that, when you trace them carefully, turn out to be structurally important. But back to Thursday's chicken. Chicken was not rationed. This fact, simple, practical, historically grounded, had enormous consequences for the wartime kitchen. Poultry, like eggs, like fresh vegetables, was outside the OPA ration system, and so chicken became the protein of the wartime kitchen to a degree that would permanently shape American eating habits. She buys a whole chicken from the butcher. A whole chicken, not chicken parts, not boneless, skinless breasts, because in 1943, the concept of purchasing only part of a chicken has not yet been invented. You buy the whole bird, you roast or stew or fry it whole, and then you use everything. The meat from the carcass for one meal, the carcass itself for stock, the liver set aside for a separate small dish, the neck and giblets simmered with onion and thickened into a gravy. Nothing is wasted because nothing can be wasted, and because there is a kind of deep satisfaction in using everything, in arriving at the end of a chicken with nothing left but clean bones, having extracted every unit of nourishment from the investment. Thursday's chicken, roasted with sage from the garden and served with mashed potatoes and green beans from her own jars, is the week's second best meal after Sunday. Her husband eats it with evident satisfaction and does not know or think about the chain of planning and calculation and management that produced it. This is not a complaint. He is tired. He has been working since 6 a.m. in a building full of noise and metal and heat. He knows she is good at this. He trusts her completely with it, and never thinks much about what it involves. This is simply how it works. She does not need him to think about what it involves. She knows what it involves. Friday. The leftover chicken, stripped from Thursday's carcass, goes into a pot of rice cooked in the stock she made from the bones. Chicken and rice. A meal that does not announce its origins, that does not taste like the end of a week's accounting, that is warm and filling and costs almost nothing because everything in it has already been paid for. The children eat it without complaint, which is all the endorsement she needs. Now let me tell you about substitutions, because the substitutions of the wartime kitchen are one of the more fascinating chapters in the history of American cooking, and they have been almost entirely forgotten. Sugar was rationed at £1 per person per week, which sounds generous until you realise that pre-war American households used about £1.5 per person per week in all their cooking and baking, and until you factor in that canning season requires sugar in quantities that exceed any individual's weekly ration, which is why the OPA created a special canning sugar allotment, a separate ration, that could be applied for separately, and which she applied for every year and planned her canning around. For everyday sweetening, saccharin was available, the artificial sweetener that had been in use since the 1880s, and that wartime sugar rationing brought into mainstream American kitchens on a permanent basis. She used it in her coffee when the sugar was running low, without enthusiasm, accepting it as the terms of the moment. Some women became quite skilled at substituting saccharin in baked goods, making adjustments for the fact that it was far sweeter than sugar and did not provide the structure that sugar contributed to the chemistry of baking. She was adequate at this, but not expert. Her cookies and cakes in those years were sometimes slightly less than they would have been in peacetime, and she noted this without distress and moved on. Butter, 16 red points a pound, and butter in cooking is not merely a flavour ingredient but a structural and chemical one that cannot always be replaced with oleo without consequences. She developed a set of mental categories, things where you could not taste the difference. Most sautéed vegetables, anything that was heavily seasoned, any recipe where butter was incidental to the dish's primary character. Things where you could absolutely taste the difference. Pie crust, layer cakes, shortbread cookies, hollandaise if she was ever making it, which during the war she was not. She used real butter where it mattered, and oleo where it did not, and she did not apologise for either choice. Meat stretching was an art she brought to a high level of competence. Ground beef extended with breadcrumbs, which absorbed the fat and added texture, and made a quarter-pound of meat feed 4 people at a dinner where the emphasis was nominally on the meat. Meatloaf. This is perhaps the great wartime meat dish, and I want to rehabilitate it slightly from the derision it sometimes receives in contemporary conversation, because the wartime meatloaf was not a sad thing. It was an intelligent thing. 1 pound of ground beef, which would feed 2 people as plain hamburgers, stretched with a cup of rolled oats and a cup of breadcrumbs and an egg and diced onion, and whatever herbs she had on hand, could feed a family of 4 as a full dinner, with enough left over for cold meatloaf sandwiches the next day. That is a remarkable performance per pound of ground beef, and the women who executed it every week were not doing something lesser than cooking. They were doing something harder. Casseroles. I want to say something genuine about casseroles, because the casserole is one of those dishes that has accumulated cultural irony in the decades since the 1940s. The church potluck dish, the suburban dinner party cliché, the thing your aunt brings to every event in a Pyrex dish with a slightly too crispy breadcrumb topping. But the casserole in 1943 was a form of intelligence. It was the technology that made small amounts of expensive ingredients go further by combining them with large amounts of inexpensive ones. A cup of canned tuna, which cost 12 blue stamps, combined with a cup of cooked noodles and a cup of canned cream of mushroom soup and a half cup of frozen peas, baked together in the oven for 30 minutes, fed 4 people. That is the value proposition of the casserole stated plainly. It was not a lazy choice. It was a precise one. She made tuna noodle casserole. She made chicken and rice casserole. She made a hamburger and potato casserole that her children called hamburger pie, because she put a biscuit crust on the top that browned in the oven, and which they ate with great enthusiasm because it combined the 2 things that children in every era of history have most wanted from dinner, which are something crispy on top and something savoury underneath. She made these things without shame and without the self-conscious awareness that they might one day become symbols of something diminished. She made them because they were good, because they were practical, because they were what she had, and because feeding 4 people well under the circumstances she had to work with was something she was genuinely good at. And she was. She was genuinely, demonstrably, competently good at it. I want to close this part of the evening with something that I think is true and important, and that I find genuinely moving when I sit with it. There is a term that historians of the period use sometimes, food morale. It sounds clinical, a little bureaucratic, but what it refers to is something entirely human, the understanding, well documented in the records of the Office of Civilian Defence and in the correspondence of the women who ran household kitchens during those years, that the quality and character of the food on the table had a direct effect on the psychological resilience of the family eating it. A warm meal, well seasoned, made with care, placed in front of people who were tired and worried and separated from people they loved, that meal was not merely nutrition, it was an act of persistence, a statement of refusal to be diminished, a way of saying, we are still here, we still eat well, we still sit at a table together, the ordinary things are still happening. She knew this, I think, not as a theory but as a feeling. The feeling that the table she set and the food she put on it was itself a form of courage. Not dramatic courage, quiet courage. The courage of showing up and doing the work every single day without exception, making the pot of soup, making the bread, making the meal that the family would gather around and eat together and feel, even in the middle of a war that had taken their men and rationed their food and pervaded every hour of their days, briefly but genuinely at home. The pot simmers, the bread cools on the rack, the coffee's put on for whenever the day requires it. She has fed her family again, tomorrow she will do it again. Let me add something to the story of the rationed kitchen that I think deserves its own moment, and that is the particular creativity that constraint produced, not in spite of the constraint but because of it. There is a school of thought in contemporary design and creativity research that says constraints don't limit creativity, they focus it, that having fewer options produces better outcomes than having infinite ones, because the problem of choice is itself a form of creative paralysis. I believe this is true in creative fields. I know it was true in the wartime kitchen. When you cannot have butter, you learn what butter actually does, in which applications it is structural, in which it is optional, in which a substitute performs adequately, and in which it decisively does not. When you cannot have sugar in unlimited quantities, you learn to use sweetness more precisely, to deploy it where it matters most, to allow the natural sweetness of certain vegetables and fruits to carry more of the work. When you cannot have the cut of meat you prefer, you learn that a less desirable cut, properly prepared with sufficient time and the right liquid, can produce results that the preferred cut never could. The wartime kitchen was a school of culinary intelligence taught by necessity, and the women who graduated from it, who spent 3 or 4 years cooking at the top of their problem-solving capacity, in full creative engagement with every meal, came out the other side with a relationship to food and cooking that was sophisticated in a way that prosperity would never have produced. She made a dish during the war years, born entirely from constraint, that she continued to make for the rest of her life. It began as an attempt to use a cut of beef that was economical in stamps and in cost, a cut that her mother had not cooked because her mother's generation had had access to better cuts regularly, a cut that required long, slow cooking to become tender. She braised it with whatever vegetables she had, with canned tomatoes from her pantry, with the wine vinegar she kept for pickling, with the dried rosemary from her herb garden. The first time she made it, it was adequate. The second time, slightly better. By the 5th or 6th time, she had found the ratio, the amount of liquid, the temperature, the duration, that transformed the tough cut into something that pulled apart in long fibres, dark and rich and deeply flavoured. The kind of dish that makes the kitchen smell good for 4 hours and that produces from inexpensive ingredients a meal that is better than one made from expensive ones. She made this dish her whole life. She made it for company eventually when company dinners were no longer constrained. She made it for her daughter's birthday because the daughter requested it. She made it for the grandchildren, who knew it as her dish, her specific contribution to the family's flavour memory, the taste that meant her house. It began as a wartime substitution, it ended as an inheritance. This is the kind of story that does not appear in histories of the period because it is not dramatic and it left no record. The dish is not written down. The recipe, if there is one, lives only in the muscle memory of the family members who watched her make it, and who could, if pressed, produce something like it, but not exactly like it, because there is no recipe, only practice, only the accumulated judgment of a woman who made this dish many dozens of times, and who each time adjusted slightly without thinking, adding a little more of one thing and a little less of another, until the dish was the dish, until it was hers. This is what knowledge looks like when it lives in bodies rather than books. The wartime household was a laboratory, though no one called it that. Every kitchen was a laboratory, and every woman who ran a kitchen was an experimenter, working within tight parameters with whatever materials were available, trying things, failing sometimes, succeeding often enough to feed the family and occasionally producing something that transcended the constraint that produced it. The OPA cooking pamphlets, which she collected throughout the war, and which she kept in the drawer with the cookbooks, are extraordinary documents if you read them now. They are practical and direct and full of information about how to make limited ingredients produce results that are good rather than merely adequate. They treat their reader as intelligent. They assume she can understand a ratio, can adjust a recipe, can make a judgment call. They are the cooking instructions of a government that needed civilian housewives to be competent and resourced them accordingly. She read them carefully, she used them, she adapted them. The adaptation is the interesting part. A recipe is a starting point, not a destination. A recipe tells you what someone else made in their kitchen under their conditions with their ingredients. It cannot tell you what you need in your kitchen under your conditions with what is actually in your pantry today. The translation between the recipe and the actual dish requires judgment, and judgment is a skill, and she had it. She had it because she had been cooking since she was a girl, learning in her mother's kitchen the way women of her generation learned most things, by watching and participating and gradually taking over. By the time she had her own kitchen, she had been cooking for 10 years. By 1943, she had been cooking for 20 years, and she knew what she was doing in the way that 20 years of practice produces knowing. This too is something that is easy to underestimate about these women. They were skilled. They were skilled in the specific demanding domain of household management and food production, and that skill was real and hard-won and consequential. The fact that it was not credentialed, not paid, not evaluated or acknowledged by any formal system, did not make it less real. The family ate well, the evidence was on the table. The weekly grocery trip deserves its own examination, because in 1943 the grocery store was not the experience we have today, and the differences reveal something important about the relationship between a household and its food supply. She walked to the grocery store. The car existed. They had a 1938 Dodge that was kept in the garage with the care that something irreplaceable receives, its tyres monitored for wear because replacement tyres were almost impossible to obtain under wartime rubber rationing. But she drove it only when the trip required carrying more than she could manage on foot, which was less often than you might think. A woman who has organised her household around a weekly grocery run, and who supplements it with the daily purchasing of specific items, the fresh bread from the bakery, the produce from the street vendor who came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, does not need to transport large quantities at once. She walked to the store with a canvas bag. The canvas shopping bag was a practical object of that era, long before it became a symbol of environmental consciousness. It was simply the container in which groceries were carried, more durable and more spacious than the paper bags the store provided, which had a tendency to fail when wet and which were saved and reused until they were beyond reuse because paper was one of the materials being conserved. The A&P was the principal grocery store. The Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, as it was formerly known, was the largest retail chain in the United States in the 1940s, with stores in every city and town, and its ubiquity was the kind of comfortable familiarity that shapes a generation's experience of the ordinary. She had shopped at the same A&P for 6 years, and the staff there knew her, not by name on their first meeting, but by the accumulated recognition of regular visits. The butcher had learned her preferences. The produce manager had learned that she would return produce that was less than fresh, rather than accepting it in the interest of saving time, which had established between them a mutual understanding that she would be offered his best. This kind of relationship between a regular customer and the people who served her was not unusual in that era, and has mostly dissolved in ours, replaced by the anonymity of large stores and self-checkout kiosks, and the assumption that shopping is a transaction rather than a repeated social encounter. She would not have described it as a social encounter. She would have described it as knowing what she was getting, and knowing that the people she was dealing with were people who could be counted on. Inside the store, the smell of wood and sawdust, because the A&P floor was wood and was swept with sawdust in the manner of butcher shops, the sawdust absorbing moisture and preventing the old building smell of a store that sees heavy foot traffic all day. The products on the shelves in the quantities that were available, which varied from visit to visit. The ration book in her purse, the stamps she was planning to use today counted and known. She moved through the store with the efficiency of someone who knows it well enough that she does not need to browse. She had a list. The list was consulted but not strictly followed, because the list was made in advance and reality adjusted on contact. If the canned salmon was not in stock, she would adapt. If the ground beef was a higher point value than expected, she would recalculate. If there was something available today that would not be available next week, she would take it regardless of whether she had planned for it. This flexibility is one of the skills of the rationed kitchen that is easy to underestimate. the ability to adapt a week's meal planning in real time at the grocery store, accounting simultaneously for what is available, what it costs in stamps and in money, what she already has at home, and what the family will actually eat. This is not a simple computation. It requires holding the whole system in working memory and adjusting it on the fly, and it requires a kind of familiarity with the system that only comes from doing it every week for months. She had done it every week for 18 months by the spring of 1943. She was good at it. She was the person that the neighbours called when they were confused about the new regulations, when the point values changed and the pamphlet had not arrived yet, when there was something at the store whose value was unclear. She was the person on the block who had read the pamphlets most carefully and understood the system most completely. This expertise was not valued by anyone who counted value in formal terms. It did not appear on a resume. It did not earn additional stamps or financial compensation. It was simply the expertise she had developed because the family needed her to have it, and she had developed it. It begins in March before the ground is entirely ready. She is out in the garden with a fork before the last frost has entirely passed, turning the soil in the way that people who garden regularly understand as a kind of conversation. The fork going in, the resistance of the cold earth, the smell of it released, the dark under the pale surface where everything is still sleeping, not yet awake, not yet ready, but listening. She had put in her first victory garden in the spring of 1942, the first year of the campaign. She had gardened before, a small bed for tomatoes and herbs at the last house. But the victory garden was different. It was larger, it was intentional, and it was, for the first time in her memory, something that the government was actively encouraging, and that her neighbours were doing alongside her, so that the backyards of the block had taken on a new character. The smell of soil and compost where there had been clipped grass, the sight of bean poles and tomato cages where there had been ornamental shrubs. The Victory Garden campaign is one of those chapters in American history that tends to be remembered sentimentally. The cheerful government posters, the image of housewives in aprons kneeling in their gardens with happy purpose, the slogan "Food Fights for Freedom." And the sentimentality can obscure how genuinely important it was. By 1943, American victory gardens were producing an estimated 40% of all fresh vegetables consumed in the United States. 40%. Grown by civilians in their backyards, in vacant lots, in public parks, in schoolyards and church grounds, and any piece of unclaimed earth that could be turned and planted. This was not decorative, it was structural. She planted tomatoes because she needed the tomatoes for canning, green beans because the children ate them and they canned well, and a full day of canning beans in August could mean beans on the table through the following April. Corn, the sweet corn that could not be stored well, but that the family would eat fresh in July and August with a greed that she found entirely understandable, because there is nothing like sweet corn at peak season, and everyone who has grown their own knows it. Cucumbers for pickling. Carrots, which could be left in the ground past frost if you mulched them properly, and pulled in October and stored in the root cellar. Onions. Beets, which she pickled in the manner her mother had taught her with vinegar and cloves, and which kept beautifully, and which her husband liked on cold meat, and which the children ate with a suspicion that gave way to tolerance over time. Squash, because squash asked almost nothing and gave back substantially. The yellow crookneck varieties that came in such abundance in late summer that she gave bags of them to the neighbours and still had more than she could use, and the winter squash varieties, butternut, Hubbard, acorn, that could be stored whole in the root cellar until December or January if the temperature stayed cool and even. Lettuce in the spring, and again in the fall, the kind of thing that can only be eaten fresh and cannot be put up. A luxury of the growing season that she allowed herself with pleasure, because lettuce in April, after the long winter of preserved and stored vegetables, was something close to revelatory. Green and cold and tasting of the actual earth, the first fresh green thing in months. Herbs along the south-facing fence, sage and thyme and rosemary and parsley and the spearmint that had gotten out of hand the second year and spread itself along the entire south edge of the garden with the cheerful invasiveness that mint is known for, and that she had stopped fighting because the family used it, in tea, in the summer drink she made with the children, in the lamb she cooked in the spring when lamb was available. The garden required work. Let me be specific about what that meant in practice. She was out in it every day from late April through October, not gardening constantly, but attending to it, a task that cannot be neglected for more than a few days without consequences. Watering, which in a dry summer meant carrying the hose out and moving it every 15 minutes because the sprinkler coverage was imperfect, and she had learned which parts of the bed were drought susceptible. Weeding, which was the work that most resembled physical meditation, the kind of repetitive bending and pulling that empties the mind and fills the body with a mild, pleasant fatigue. Staking the tomatoes as they grew because her variety, beefsteak, grew tall and needed support and would fall and sprawl and get diseased if she let them go unstaked. Tying the bean tendrils to their poles, thinning the carrots, which was the task she found most disheartening. Pulling up perfectly good small carrots to give the larger ones room to grow, but which she did faithfully because she had learned the hard way that unthinned carrots grew forked and stunted. Watching for the pests. The aphids on the underside of the bean leaves, the tomato hornworm that could strip a plant overnight and that she inspected for each evening with a flashlight, picking them off by hand and dropping them in a can of soapy water, because in 1943 most of the pesticides that would be developed in the following decades did not yet exist for residential use, and the control of garden pests was still mostly a matter of attention and hands. The cucumber beetles that came for the cucumbers every year, and that she treated with a dusting of rotenone, a botanical insecticide derived from tropical plant roots that was the most effective option available, and that she applied in the early morning when the dew was still on the plants and the beetles were sluggish. The deer that came at night from the small woodlot 2 blocks away, that had learned the block's gardens were easier foraging than the woods, and that she had eventually deterred by stringing fishing line around the perimeter at 2 heights, a trick she had learned from her neighbour who had learned it from a magazine article, and that worked with the particular deer logic reliability of a system that is odd enough to confuse an animal that is wary of the obvious. She talked to the garden. I mention this not as a charming detail, but as something that she herself, later, in retrospect, would name as something she genuinely did. Not talking to the plants in the way the popular notion of plant communication implies, but talking the way people talk to themselves when they're working, narrating the task, noting what she was seeing, a running account of observation. The beans look good. The second row of tomatoes needs a stake. Something is eating the basil again. By August, the garden was in full production, and the kitchen became a canning operation. August. Let me tell you about August in this kitchen. The pressure canner dominated the stove from early August through the end of September. It was a large aluminum vessel, 15 quarts, heavy enough that lifting it required both hands and the particular technique of someone who has learned to carry heavy things efficiently, not by brute strength but by balance and momentum. When it was full of jars and water and running at pressure, it hissed with a specific sound that she could hear from anywhere in the house, a sound that meant everything was going according to plan, and that an unexpected silence would break her concentration instantly, because a pressure canner that goes silent when it should be hissing is a pressure canner that has lost pressure and means the timing must begin again. The canning process, in its detail and its demands, is one of those activities that modern people tend to either romanticize or dismiss, and both responses miss what it actually was. It was not a craft project. It was not a hobby. It was not something done for the aesthetic pleasure of a shelf lined with beautiful jars, though the aesthetic pleasure was real and she felt it. It was a biological process that required precision and attention, because the consequences of imprecision were serious. Improperly processed food in sealed jars can harbour botulinum toxin, which is invisible, odourless, and lethal. She knew this. The Extension Service pamphlets were explicit about it. The time charts for each type of food were specific and non-negotiable, based on the work of food scientists who had established what temperatures and durations were required to make each type of food safe. She followed the charts. She kept notes. She processed each batch fully to the proper time and temperature without cutting corners, because the food in those jars would be eaten by her children in January, and she was not willing to take risks with it. This was not paranoia. It was competence. The kitchen in August. Let me try to put you inside it. The temperature outside is 92 degrees, which is hot in the inland way of the middle American summer, the air heavy and still. The kitchen, where the stove has been running since 7 in the morning, is hotter. Not oppressive, but insistent, a working heat, the kind that settles into your clothes and your hair, and that by mid-morning has made the glass of iced tea on the counter into a necessity rather than a preference. The ice was delivered twice a week by the iceman, a fading institution in 1943 but not yet entirely replaced by the refrigerator in every household. The smell in the kitchen in August is specific and complex. Tomatoes cooking down, the deep savoury sweetness of them, a smell that is not quite anything else. The faint sharpness of vinegar if she's doing pickles. The steam from the canner, which smells of very hot water and metal, and the particular mineral cleanness of things being made very clean by heat. The damp of the dish towels she has spread across every surface to rest the hot jars on, because you do not set a hot jar directly on a cold counter, and you do not set it directly on a metal surface, because the thermal shock will crack it, and a cracked jar is wasted. She moves between the stove and the counter and the sink in a pattern so practiced it has become choreography. She knows exactly how long she has between steps. She's done this enough times that the canning process is running in the background of her mind rather than in the foreground. She's thinking about other things, making plans, reviewing the week, listening to the radio, but a part of her attention is always on the timer and the temperature and the sound of the canner. The jars come out. A pair of rubber-lined canning tongs, the tool that allows you to lift a full quart jar of boiling tomatoes without burning yourself, places each jar carefully on the dish towels. She counts them without thinking. Then the listening. This is the part of canning that she loves most, and she would tell you so if you asked. After the hot jars are out of the canner and sitting on the counter, as they begin to cool, they seal. The lids pop down, a small sharp sound like a finger snap, as the vacuum forms inside. One after another, across the cooling jars, each one declaring its success with that sound. Pop, pop, pop. Every pop is a jar successfully sealed. Every pop is food that will be safe to eat in January. Every pop is a small investment in the family's winter that has just matured. She keeps count of the pops because an unsealed jar, one that does not pop, whose lid does not dome down, must be refrigerated and used immediately, its contents not safe for long storage. But in a good run, most jars seal. In a perfect run, all of them do. And when the last jar has cooled and she lifts it, holds it up to the light, sees the dome of the lid pressed down, hears the solid ring of a properly sealed jar when she taps it with her fingernail, that is a moment of genuine satisfaction. Not performed satisfaction, not the satisfaction of a completed task for its own sake. The satisfaction of competence in service of something that matters, of work that will extend beyond today into the cold months ahead. By October the canning shelf was full. Rows and rows of quart jars and pint jars, their lids silver and dimpled in with the vacuum, the contents visible through the glass, the deep red of the stewed tomatoes, the medium red of the tomato sauce, the pale yellow of the corn, the green of the beans, the burgundy of the beets, the amber of the peach preserves, the dark mahogany of the apple butter, the bread and butter pickles in their translucent brine, the sliced cucumbers still faintly bright against the yellow liquid. She labelled each jar in her handwriting. Tomatoes, August 43. Green beans, August 43. Apple butter, October 43. The labels were small pieces of paper she cut from a paper bag and affixed with a dab of rubber cement, and they told the story of a summer's labour in the most compressed form imaginable. 412 jars. She did not count them for vanity. She counted them because inventory management required knowing what you had, and because knowing you had 412 jars in October meant being able to plan with a degree of confidence what the family would eat through the following winter, what she would still need to buy, what she did not need to worry about. 412 jars. Winter is taken care of. I want to spend a moment with something that I think is easy to miss in the history of victory gardens and home canning, something that the cheerful government posters do not quite capture. The victory garden was, in its quiet way, a form of political participation. The women who planted them understood this, I believe, even if they did not always articulate it in those terms. The garden was a place where agency lived when so much else was outside their control. The men were away, or working long hours in defence plants, or in some cases still being called up. The husband, in our kitchen, was 34 in 1943, and the selective service age limit had been raised to 38 earlier in the year, and she had read about it in the newspaper, and she had not said anything about it at supper, and he had not said anything about it either, but they both knew. The garden was something she could do, something direct and physical and productive that connected her effort to the outcome she wanted, which was not complicated. The family fed, the war ended, the men home. She turned the soil, she planted the seeds, she tended the rows, she harvested the vegetables and put them up in glass jars that lined her shelves through the winter, with the evidence of her labour visible and counted and real. And in the particular silence of a canning kitchen in August, with the steam rising and the jars cooling and the pops of sealing lids marking time, she was not a passive recipient of events too large to influence. She was someone doing the work. The last jar sealed with a sound like a punctuation mark, a small declarative. She counted the jars one more time. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree was just beginning, at the tips of its upper branches, to turn. The spring garden begins in the mind before it begins in the ground. She was planning the garden in February, when the seed catalogues arrived in the mail and the backyard was still frozen, because a garden that is not planned is a garden that is managed reactively, and reactive management is how you end up with too much zucchini and not enough tomatoes, with the wrong spacing and the wrong timing, and the sense in August that the summer is managing you rather than the other way around. She kept a notebook, a small brown-covered composition notebook of the kind sold at the 5 and dime, with the ruled lines and the marbled cover, purchased at the beginning of each gardening year and kept in the kitchen drawer with the seed packets and the extension service pamphlets. In this notebook she recorded what she planted, where she planted it, what the results were. The yields of the previous year were the planning data for the current year. If the early girl tomatoes had done better in the left side of the bed, she planted them there again. If the pole beans had struggled, she tried a different location or a different variety. The seed catalogue from Burpee arrived in late January, and she read it with the careful attention of someone who is making purchasing decisions with real stakes. The catalogue was thick, optimistic, full of colour illustrations of vegetables in their ideal state, the kind of idealised images that you learn to discount after several years of actual gardening, but that still had the power to make a February afternoon feel briefly like June. She chose the varieties she trusted from experience, and occasionally a new one that the catalogue's description suggested might perform well in her climate and soil. She ordered the seeds in February so they would arrive in time for starting the indoor seedlings, the tomatoes and peppers and eggplant that needed 6 to 8 weeks of indoor growing before they were strong enough to go into the ground. The indoor seed starting happened on the kitchen windowsill in March. Small clay pots and later paper cups, filled with a mixture of garden soil and compost, the seeds pressed in at the right depth. She knew the depth without measuring, the judgment built into her fingers after years of planting, the pots arranged in the south-facing kitchen window where they would get the maximum winter light. She checked them daily. She watered them with a care that was specifically calibrated for seedlings, which drown as easily as they dry out, the watering done with a small can whose spout poured a fine stream, not a splash. When the seedlings were up, the particular joy of the first sprout, the hairpin green curve pushing through the soil, she began the hardening off, the gradual introduction of outdoor conditions, carrying the seedlings out to the porch for increasing hours each day, letting them adapt to the outdoor temperature and the direct sun before she asked them to live in the ground permanently. This is not a procedure she invented. It is a procedure she learned from her mother and from the extension service pamphlets and from her neighbour Mrs. D'Angelo, who had been gardening in that climate for 25 years and who had opinions about hardening off that were definitive and not to be questioned. Mrs. D'Angelo was the gardening authority of the block, not by appointment but by consensus, the woman whose tomatoes were always ready a week before everyone else's, and whose beans were always straighter, and whose pepper plants were always more productive, and whose methods were therefore studied and applied by the surrounding gardeners with the reverence that genuine expertise earns. She had learned from Mrs. D'Angelo not just technique but philosophy. Mrs. D'Angelo believed that the garden rewarded attention more than effort, that the most important tool was observation, that you had to spend time simply watching the leaves, the soil, the light at different times of day, before you could understand what the garden needed. She had applied this philosophy and found it accurate. The years when she had been most attentive to the garden had been the most productive years. The years when other demands had reduced her garden time to a minimum had been years of missed problems, late interventions, lower yields. The garden wanted presence, It wanted the kind of daily observation that catches the first aphid before it becomes a colony, the dry soil before it becomes stressed, the tomato plant leaning before it falls. It wanted her there. She was there. She went to the garden every day from April through October. Not for hours, not always for more than 20 minutes, but consistently, the way a doctor makes rounds, the way a manager walks the floor, the routine presence that allows you to notice what would otherwise go unnoticed until it had become a problem. In early June, when the tomato plants were knee-high and beginning to set their first flowers, she walked between the rows on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee, looking at each plant. She saw a curled leaf on the third plant from the left, the beefsteak her best producer, and she recognised it as the early sign of aphids, and she addressed it that afternoon with a spray of soapy water, which she made from a few drops of dish soap in a spray bottle, and which killed the aphids on contact without harming the plant. The aphids did not become a colony. The beefsteak produced abundantly in August. This is what garden management looks like at its best. The prevention that costs almost nothing because it happened early, before the problem had momentum. She was good at this. She was good at it in the garden, and she was good at it in every other domain she managed. The household, the children, the finances, the relationships. The early attention that costs a small effort and prevents the large one. Preventive management is not exciting. It does not produce dramatic stories about crises resolved. It produces a garden that yields well, a house that runs smoothly, children who are not in crisis, a budget that is not in emergency, a life that appears, from the outside, to be running without effort, because the effort was applied at the right moment and has become invisible. This is the paradox of competent management. It is invisible to people who have not practiced it, and therefore routinely mistaken for effortlessness, and therefore routinely undervalued, because we value what appears to require effort, and discount what appears to require none, even when the appearance of effortlessness is itself the product of significant skill. She was undervalued by this logic. She knew it, in the way that people know things that are true and uncomfortable, and that there is no productive response to, and she went on doing the work. The August canning. Let me tell you about a specific day in August 1943, a day I have reconstructed from what I know of these kitchens and these practices, and what the women who lived through them described later in the oral histories and the memoirs and the letters to their daughters that constitute our access to that world. It is the first week of August. The tomatoes have come in all at once, as tomatoes do, the indeterminate varieties continuing to produce long after the determinates have given their entire yield in a single 2-week rush. She has been watching the plants, assessing the ripeness, waiting for the moment when enough tomatoes are at peak ripeness simultaneously to make a full canning run worthwhile, because you do not run the pressure canner for 6 jars, you run it for 30. This morning 30 tomatoes are ready. She rises at 5, and by 6:30 she has scalded and peeled the 30 tomatoes, the skin slipping off in the particular way that blanched tomatoes peel, the red flesh wet and dense in her hands, and she has cut them and pressed them into the quart jars with a wooden spoon, tamping them down to pack as many as possible, leaving the headspace that the recipe requires for the expansion of the contents under heat, and she has added the teaspoon of salt and the teaspoon of lemon juice that the extension service pamphlets require for acidity. The lemon juice. This is the kind of detail that matters enormously in canning, and that is almost never explained in the casual way that canning is discussed. The addition of acid, lemon juice or vinegar, to low-acid vegetables and fruits before canning is required by the food safety guidelines, because it lowers the pH of the contents below the level at which botulinum can form. She adds it without thinking, because she always adds it, because the first year she canned, the extension service pamphlet told her to add it, and she added it, and she has added it ever since. This habit, unremarkable as a habit, has made 35 years of home canning food safe for her family. She puts the jars in the canner. She puts the canner on the stove. She waits for the pressure to build, watching the weighted gauge, the jiggling weight that tells her the pressure is at the right level, the particular rhythm of the jiggling that means everything is running correctly, 1 to 3 jiggles per minute, the sound of a correctly running pressure canner at the right temperature. She sets the timer. 25 minutes for quarts of tomatoes, her kitchen altitude, her specific canner. And then she does other things. This is the invisible productivity of the canning session, the thing that never gets noted in the histories. She does not stand at the canner for 25 minutes. She puts the canner on and goes and does other things, because 25 minutes is enough time to start the bread, enough time to make the beds, enough time to weed the close row of carrots that needs attention, enough time to write half of his Tuesday letter. She does not let time idle if there is work to be done. The canner runs, she moves, the kitchen and the house absorb her attention in the spaces between the canning tasks, and by noon she has done the morning's canning and started the bread and made the beds and weeded the carrots and written most of the letter and put a pot of soup on the back burner from last night's chicken carcass. And the jars are cooling on the counter. And she is counting the pops. The relationship between a person and a piece of land that they tend over years is one of those relationships that is difficult to describe from the outside. It is not romantic in the sentimental sense. It is not simply functional. It is something more specific than either. A relationship built from repeated attention and response, from learning the particular characteristics of this soil in this location, with this light and these pests and this particular microclimate, that makes the south-facing wall 2 degrees warmer than the north side of the bed. She had been gardening this plot for 6 years by 1943. She had amended the soil each year with compost from the pile at the back of the yard, the pile that received the kitchen vegetable scraps and the coffee grounds and the eggshells and the lawn clippings and the leaves in fall, and that she turned twice a year with a heavy fork, the turning aerating the pile and accelerating the breakdown. The soil in the garden beds was noticeably different in texture and colour from the soil in the grass areas of the yard. Darker, looser, more friable. The particular quality that people who know soil call tilth, a word that is old and precise, and that means the condition of being well prepared for growing. She knew her soil the way she knew the oven, by feel, by what it did under her hands, by the way it behaved when wet and when dry, how long it held moisture and how quickly it drained, which areas were inclined to compact and which retained their looseness. She knew this not from reading but from years of hands-on management, from the feedback loop of planting and growing and observing and adjusting. The carrots, for example. She had learned in the 3rd year of the garden that the left side of the second bed had a layer of clay, about 8 inches down, that the carrots hit and around which they forked. The solution she had eventually arrived at was to double dig that section, spading the soil to a full 2 feet, breaking up the clay layer, amending it heavily. And since the double digging, she had grown straight carrots in that section consistently. But she had only known about the clay layer because she had dug out the forked carrots and followed them down to see what had happened to them. This is what learning from a garden looks like, not reading a book about carrots, not consulting an expert, digging out the forked carrots and following them to the clay layer, seeing what happened and figuring out why. The tomatoes were her great subject. She had tried 8 or 9 varieties over the years and had arrived at the ones she trusted. Beefsteak for fresh eating and canning in full quarts, because the large fruit meant fewer cuts per jar. Early girl for the early season, because she needed tomatoes to start coming in by late July, and the beefsteak wasn't ready until August. Roma for paste, because the meaty flesh with few seeds produced the most solid paste per pound of fruit. She planted all 3 in the garden in 1943, arranging them with attention to their mature size. The beefsteak plants grew to 6 feet, and needed staking and sufficient spacing. The early girl was more compact. The Roma was determinate and would ripen its whole crop within 2 or 3 weeks, which was perfect for the paste-making that she did in a single session. The paste-making was a slightly different production than the whole tomato canning. The Romas were roasted first, split, oiled, salted, put in the oven at low heat for 2 hours until they had collapsed and concentrated, the sugars caramelized, the moisture reduced, the tomato flavor intensified to something that tasted more like tomato than a raw tomato did. Then run through the food mill to remove the skins and seeds. Then cooked down further with garlic and herbs on the stovetop until the consistency was thick enough to coat a spoon, then put up in pint jars. A pint of this paste was the equivalent of many cans of the commercial product in terms of flavor intensity. She had developed it by iteration over several years, adjusting the roasting time and temperature, adjusting the seasoning, adjusting the cooking down time, and had arrived at something that was hers, specific to her kitchen and her garden and her preferences. She gave a jar of it to Mrs. D'Angelo one year as a gift, the way you give a gift to the person whose opinion you most respect. Mrs. D'Angelo tasted it and said nothing for a moment, which was the highest compliment she gave to anything, and then she said, "The roasting, that is what does it," and she said yes, and they discussed the roasting for 20 minutes over the fence in the September sun. Two women talking about tomatoes with the specificity of people for whom the subject is genuinely interesting and important. She did not do this alone. I want to be clear about this because the image of the wartime housewife, when we hold it up and look at it, tends to be a solitary image. A woman at a stove, a woman in a garden, a woman at a sewing machine with a look of determined concentration. And while the solitude is real in the sense that much of the labour was done in individual kitchens and individual gardens by individual women, the social context of it was profoundly collective in ways that shaped how it was experienced and what it was possible to accomplish. The neighbourhood in 1943 was a different institution than the neighbourhood is today, different not in the sense of being better or worse, but different in its density, its interdependence, its daily texture. People knew each other, not in the curated sense of modern acquaintanceship, the relationship maintained across carefully managed social media profiles. They knew each other with the knowledge that comes from proximity and shared circumstance, from seeing each other every day at the fence line and the mailbox and the corner grocery and the block warden meeting and the Red Cross chapter that met on Thursday evenings. The block warden system was a real institution of the wartime American neighbourhood, an extension of the Office of Civilian Defence that assigned a neighbourhood volunteer to each block to coordinate civil defence activities. Air raid drills, blackout compliance, information distribution about rationing and recycling and scrap drives. The warden in her block was a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Finneran, who wore her warden's armband with a dignity that stopped just short of self-importance, and who knew everything that was happening on the block at all times, a characteristic that in peacetime would have been called nosiness, and in wartime was called civic engagement and was, in practice, both. She liked Mrs. Finneran, she found her slightly exhausting and fundamentally good. The block scrap drive happened the third Saturday of every month, organised by Mrs. Finneran with the assistance of the three families at the end of the block, who had large enough garages to serve as collection points. Tin cans, aluminium pots and pans, old tools, wire. The collection was then taken to the central depot, from which it was forwarded to the war production system. She contributed to the scrap drives with a methodical regularity that was part of the larger domestic accounting system she ran. When a tin can was empty, she washed it, removed both ends, flattened it, and added it to the collection box she kept in the basement. The pot she replaced had gone to the scrap drive. The colander that had developed a crack, the grater that was beyond sharpening. But the neighbourhood was most itself in the unorganised moments, the spontaneous economy of mutual assistance that the proximity of people in shared circumstances produces naturally. She borrowed and was borrowed from. Not money. That would have felt different, weighted with the anxiety of obligation in a way that other exchanges were not. But eggs when the hens were not laying, a cup of flour when she'd run low between grocery trips. The use of the pressure canner for an afternoon when the neighbour's was being repaired. Recipes which travelled across fences and over telephone wires with the speed of genuinely useful information. The name of the butcher on Clement Street who sometimes had extra pork without requiring excessive stamps. The knowledge that the A&P on Geary would have canned salmon in stock on Thursday morning if you arrived when the doors opened. This information was not trivial. It was the intelligence network of the wartime home front, and it operated through the social infrastructure of the neighbourhood, the conversations at the fence, the exchanges at the clothesline, the coffee clatch that 2 doors down on Tuesday mornings where 4 women sat around a kitchen table with their coffee and their mending and their ration books and talked about everything, which meant they talked about the war and what they knew about the men and the prices and the news, but also about the ordinary things that keep people human during difficult times, the children, the neighbours, the small dramas of the block, the funny thing that happened at the grocery store. The Red Cross chapter was where she had volunteered since the winter of 1941. She had signed up the week after Pearl Harbor, the way many women of her acquaintance had, not in a burst of dramatic patriotism, though the feeling behind it was real, but with the specific purpose of a woman who needs to do something and has identified the most useful thing available. The chapter met Thursday evenings at the community centre 6 blocks away. She walked. Gasoline rationing made driving to a 6-block destination an extravagance that she would not have considered regardless, and she walked back alone after the meeting in the dark with a flashlight, which was how women in those years moved through their neighbourhoods after dark, with the practical unself-consciousness of people who had decided that the neighbourhood was theirs. What they did at the Red Cross chapter varied by need. They rolled bandages, not in the slightly theatrical way that the newsreel film showed women doing it, but methodically, following the specifications, a certain width and firmness, hundreds per session. They knitted. The volume of knitting that American civilian women produced during the Second World War for military and humanitarian distribution has never been fully calculated, but it was enormous and it was real. Socks and sweaters and watch caps and mittens that went to soldiers and to refugees and to the civilian populations of bombed European cities. She was a proficient knitter. She had learned as a girl from her grandmother, and she had kept it up as an evening occupation. And in the Red Cross chapter, her proficiency was valued in the practical way that competence is always valued in organisations that have real work to do. She also served in the chapter's emergency assistance programme, which meant that when a family on the block or in the neighbourhood was in crisis, a death, an accident, a hospitalisation, she was one of the people who showed up. With food, usually, because food is the form of care that is most concrete and most immediate and most reliably useful in the first days of a loss, when the family is not able to feed itself because grief is consuming the attention that ordinary life requires. She had shown up with a pot of soup for Mrs. Hanson when the telegram came. She had shown up with a casserole for the DeLuca family when their youngest was in the hospital with appendicitis. She had received once the same kind of care herself when her mother died in the winter of 1942, and the women of the block had appeared at her door with food and with the particular wordless competence of women who know what to do when words are inadequate. There was a moment at one of the Red Cross meetings that she would remember for many years. They were rolling bandages, all of them, the room quiet in the companionable way of shared work, and someone put the news broadcast on the radio that sat on the shelf in the corner, and the voice of the broadcaster came into the room and described something happening in the Pacific that was not good, that was in fact very not good, and the women kept rolling bandages. They did not stop. They looked at each other across the table with the knowledge in their faces, and they kept their hands moving, and nobody said anything for a minute. And then one of them, Mrs. Kowalski, who had 2 boys in the Pacific and who never showed anything at these meetings except steady competence, made a small joke about the width of the bandage she was rolling, something not funny but offered as an act of will in the direction of continuity, and the others met it with the thanks it was due and kept working. That is not a dramatic story. That is simply the description of a group of women continuing to do the work in the presence of fear, which is less dramatic than the moments of singular courage that history tends to record, but which is, in aggregate, possibly the thing that holds the world together. The neighbours immediately adjacent on both sides were the women she knew best, which was the geography of the ordinary friendship of that era. The people close enough to call across the fence, close enough to hear each other's business whether they wanted to or not, close enough that the boundaries between households had a productive porosity. Children moved between the yards, gardens were compared and seeds exchanged. The Tuesday morning coffee at the Petersons was the weekly version of the shared intelligence that happened in smaller doses across the fence every day. Mrs. Peterson, on the immediate right, was a woman she admired without entirely understanding. The kind of person who seemed to run on a different internal temperature than most people, warm but efficient, quick but not hurried, with a precision in everything she did that was impressive to watch and slightly intimidating to try to match. Her garden was better organised than any of the others on the block. Her jars were labelled with a consistency that bordered on the typographic. Her husband was in the Navy, somewhere in the Pacific, and she did not talk about it except in the most practical terms. He is there, he is well, I have not heard otherwise. Mrs. D'Angelo on the left was different. She was from a family that had immigrated from Sicily before the First World War, and she cooked in a way that was different from the Midwestern Protestant cooking that was the default register of the block's kitchens, and she was the person from whom she had learned things about food that had changed the way she cooked. How to work with a can of anchovies to create depth in a tomato sauce without the anchovies being detectable as themselves. How to stretch dried beans with a small amount of pork and achieve a richness that the beans alone would not have. The particular technique of slow cooking onions until they were almost caramelized, which took patience, but which changed the flavour of anything they went into. These lessons were not taught formally. They were the byproduct of borrowing a pot and staying for coffee, of admiring a dish at a block gathering and being walked through it over the fence the following morning. They were the knowledge economy of women in proximity, which is one of the oldest forms of education in the world and one of the least documented. I want to ask you something honest before we move on, and I want you to take it seriously as a question rather than as a rhetorical move. Do you know your neighbours? Not their names, necessarily, though that would be a place to start. I mean, do you know their situation? Do you know what they are dealing with? Do you know if they are having a hard time? Do you know whether there is someone on your block or in your building who is eating lunch alone every day because there is no one to share it with? I ask this not to make you feel guilty, because I do not think guilt is a productive response to the question. I ask it because the neighbourhoods of 1943 were not communities because people were better people. They were communities because the circumstances demanded it, because the war made isolation impossible, and the rationing made cooperation logical, and the proximity made knowing each other inevitable. When those circumstances changed, when the war ended and the car made it possible to go further and the television made it possible to stay home, the neighbourhood slowly became something different. And I think we lost something in that, something that we are still trying to name. She walks home from the Red Cross meeting through the dark of the block's quiet streets. The blackout curtains are drawn in every window, the wartime precaution against showing light that enemy aircraft might use to orient themselves, which in inland America is a remote theoretical concern but which everyone maintains because the rules are the rules, and because maintaining them is part of the collective project they have signed on to. Through the curtains, here and there, the faint amber glow of a dial. The radio playing. She lets herself in through the front door with its stuck hinge, which she has long since stopped hearing as a problem and simply knows as the particular sound of home. The social world of the 1940s American neighbourhood was organised around a set of institutions that have mostly dissolved or transformed beyond recognition in the decades since, and understanding those institutions helps explain how the community worked and what it provided to the women who lived inside it. The Block Association, or its informal equivalent in neighbourhoods that did not have a formal association, was the primary organisational unit below the level of the city government. It was not necessarily formal. In many neighbourhoods it was simply the understood collection of households on a particular street who had agreed, through decades of proximity, on certain shared obligations and certain shared resources. The understanding that you helped your neighbour when they were in need, that you would take their newspaper in if they were away, that you would call if you saw something concerning, that you would bring food when there was a loss. This informal contract was more binding than any formal agreement because it was enforced by the daily reality of living in proximity. You could not fulfill it without visible consequence, without the social knowledge of the block that you were someone who could not be counted on, and this knowledge, in a community where people knew each other well, had real and lasting consequences. She was reliable. This was known. When the Hendersons needed something, she was there. When the Kowalskis were short a hand for a project, she contributed. When a new family moved into the house at the end of the block in the spring of 1943, she was one of the women who appeared at their door with a covered dish and an offer of assistance with the Victory Garden, which was one of the recognised ways that established residents welcomed newcomers and simultaneously recruited them into the network of mutual support that made the block function. The covered dish as a social institution deserves more attention than it usually receives. A covered dish brought to a new neighbour, a sick neighbour, a grieving neighbour. This is an act that is simultaneously practical and symbolic, that says both here is food, which you need and I can provide, and here is my presence. I am here, I have come to you. The symbolism works because it is true. The act of cooking for someone requires the expenditure of real time and real resources, and bringing the result of that expenditure to another person is a gift that is specific and irreplaceable. There is no substitute for food when you're too exhausted to cook for yourself. There is no substitute for the evidence that someone thought of you and did the work. She had received this gift when her mother died. She understood what it meant. She gave it consistently and without expecting acknowledgement, because giving it was not about the acknowledgement. It was about understanding that the social fabric was made of these small acts and that the fabric only held if people continued to make them. The neighbourhood also functioned as a childcare network of a kind that modern neighbourhoods rarely provide. Not formal childcare. There were no daycare centres in this neighbourhood, no commercial provision of child supervision, but the informal management of children across households that was possible when people knew each other well and trusted each other was a resource that simplified the daily logistics considerably. The older children could go to the Petersons after school if she was running late. The younger one could spend the afternoon at Mrs. D'Angelo's yard if she needed to make a grocery run that would take too long to include a small child. These exchanges were reciprocal without being calculated. She did the same for her neighbours when they needed it, without keeping score, because keeping score would have transformed a gift into a transaction and destroyed the thing that made it valuable. She knew the children of the block by name and by personality. She knew which children were safe to leave unsupervised together and which combinations produced conflict. She knew whose children were having trouble at school and whose were managing well. This was not surveillance. It was the knowledge that comes from presence, from watching the block's children grow up from the kitchen window, from the conversations at the fence and the walk home from school. In the evening, sometimes the block had a particular quality that I find difficult to describe but will try. On summer evenings, when the heat had let up a little, when the men were home from work and the children were still playing in the yards, when the dinner smells from each house drifted out through the open windows, the fried chicken from the D'Angelos, something with garlic from the Kowalskis, the particular sweetness of the corn she'd boiled for the family. There was a sense of the block as a single organism, everyone in their separate houses but connected by the smells and the sounds and the shared understanding of what this time was and what it required. She stood at the kitchen window on those evenings and felt it, the community that she was part of and that was part of her, the web of obligations and friendships and shared knowledge and mutual care that was the social context of her days. She had not chosen these people. They had not chosen her. They were simply the people who lived nearby, assembled by the logic of housing availability and economic circumstance, and the particular moment in time when each family had needed a place to live. And yet they were her people. They were the community she had built from the material available to her, and she had built it well, with the same quality of attention and sustained effort she brought to the garden and the kitchen and the children. The Block Association met on the second Tuesday of each month in the Whitakers' basement, the largest basement available for the purpose. The meetings addressed the formal business of civil defence compliance, the scrap drive schedule, the Victory Garden programme updates from the Extension Service, the occasional neighbourhood matter that required collective decision. They lasted an hour. After the formal meeting, invariably someone produced coffee and something baked, because the offer of food at a gathering was as automatic as the chairs, not something anyone decided to do on this particular occasion, but something that was simply what you did when people gathered, and the hour after the meeting was the hour in which the actual community business was conducted. The news of the block, the concerns shared informally, the knowledge exchanged, the checking in on each other that was the real purpose of the gathering, and that the formal meeting provided a framework for. She stayed for the full 2 hours, every month. She stayed because the community required her presence the way the garden required her presence, the daily or weekly attendance that constituted the difference between a thing that functions and a thing that does not. There is a letter on the counter. She sees it when she comes in. It is against the sugar bowl, as it always is when he leaves it for her to find, the way the postman leaves things that are too important to let fall to the floor. Her name in the handwriting she would know anywhere. She does not open it immediately. This is the thing she does, a small private ritual that perhaps no one else knows about, though she would not call it a ritual. She sets down her grocery bag. She fills the kettle for tea. She takes off her coat and hangs it on the hook by the door. And only then, when the tea is made and she's sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around the warm cup, does she pick up the letter. This is not hesitation, it is preparation. The letters from overseas arrived with a delay that was itself a form of uncertainty. A letter written on a Tuesday in England might arrive 3 weeks later, in California or Ohio, or wherever home was, and in those 3 weeks anything might have happened, and the letter you were holding when you finally opened it was a message from the past, a voice from a Tuesday that was now 21 days ago, reporting conditions that no longer obtained in a world that had continued to change without stopping to wait for the postal system. She knew this. Every woman whose husband or son or brother was overseas knew it. The letter was evidence that on the date it was written, the person was alive and well enough to write. It was not evidence about anything after that. She held the letters in her hands and tried not to think about the gap between the date at the top and the date she was sitting at the kitchen table reading. 3 weeks. She tried not to think about 3 weeks. He wrote to her twice a week when the mail was running. Sometimes a week would go by with nothing, and she would calculate. The mail was slower from some regions than others. The censors sometimes held letters for reasons that were never explained. The movement of troops disrupted the postal routes. Any of these things. And she would make herself not calculate and then calculate again. And then 2 letters would arrive on the same day, which was relief, and also a reminder of the calculation she had been trying not to do. The letters were, many of them, censored. The military censors read the correspondence of servicemen before it left the war theatre, and anything that might constitute intelligence, unit locations, specific operations, dates of movements, was blacked out with heavy ink or in some cases cut away entirely, leaving small rectangular windows in the paper through which you could see nothing. She had received letters with these windows in them, the light coming through the absence of what had been redacted, and she had held them up to examine the blank spaces as if looking closely enough might tell her something. It never told her anything. What he wrote about in the spaces the censors left was small things, the food, which he had opinions about, the weather, the men he served with, described with the particular affection that proximity under difficult circumstances produces, the nicknames and the jokes that had developed within the group, the small daily details of life that conveyed, by accumulation, something real about where he was and how he was doing. He wrote about her. He wrote about the children, asking specific questions about specific things that she had mentioned in her previous letters, asking about the garden and the canning and the progress of the children's school year. He wrote as if the distance were temporary, which it was. He wrote as if the ordinary life of the house were ongoing and real and would be resumed, which it would be. He wrote with a practical confidence about the future that she found sometimes sustaining and sometimes, in her most honest moments, difficult to match. She matched it in her own letters. She wrote to him about the garden and the canning and the children and the neighbourhood, with the same practised cheerfulness that she maintained in the house itself, not because she did not feel fear, but because fear was not what he needed in his letters, and fear was also not what she could afford to live in if the household was going to function. She could feel it in the background. She could acknowledge it in the quiet hour before dawn, when the house was dark and there was no one for whom to be cheerful. But she could not let it run the days. The V-mail system, introduced in June of 1942, had changed the letter writing to some degree. V-mail, Victory Mail, was a system by which letters were photographed onto microfilm, shipped across the ocean on the microfilm, and then printed out at the receiving end as photographs of the original documents, about a quarter of the original size. The advantage was logistics. A single reel of microfilm could carry thousands of letters, where the original paper would have taken many bags of mail. The disadvantage was intimacy. A printed photograph of a letter is not quite a letter. The paper is different, the scale is different, the handwriting appears smaller and somehow less present. She had adapted to V-mail because she had to, but she preferred the original letters when they came through the regular mail, because the paper he had touched was still the paper she held, and this mattered in a way that she would not have been able to justify logically. In his most recent letter, which had arrived 12 days ago and which she had read 3 times, he had mentioned the weather in terms that told her approximately where he was without naming it. She was not going to tell anyone what she had inferred, and she was not going to write back confirming it, because she understood what the censorship was for and she supported it, and also because the knowledge that she carried was both precious and terrifying, and she did not want to examine it too closely. The Gold Star flags. The first one appeared in the window of the Hendersons, who lived 4 houses down, on a Wednesday in November. She'd seen it when she walked home from the grocery store, the small flag in the window with its gold star on blue field, the emblem that every family with a member in the service received as a service flag and displayed in their window, a blue star for each family member in service, and that became a gold star when the blue star was replaced by gold, the permanent replacement, the indication that the person represented by that star was not coming home. She'd known what it meant before she reached the Hendersons' front path. She'd known it the way you know certain things before you can bring yourself to say them, the information landing in the body before it reaches language. The Hendersons' son was 22 years old. She'd watched him grow up on that block. He had been on the high school baseball team. She did not go to the Hendersons that day. She went home, finished what she needed to finish, put supper on, got the children through their evening, got them to bed. And then she sat at the kitchen table alone after the house was quiet, and she let herself feel what the day had contained, the full weight of it, without managing it or narrating it or making it mean something it did not mean. She just sat with it. And then she did what she always did. She got up. She covered the pot on the back of the stove. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. In the morning she went to the Hendersons with a casserole and she stayed for an hour and she listened. This was what she had to give. The particular work of managing fear in front of the children is something that I find very hard to write about, because it is one of those invisible competencies that are never named as competencies and that require a level of sustained effort that cannot be adequately conveyed. She did not discuss the war with her children in the way that the war might have been discussed if the adults had not made a collective decision, largely implicit, to protect the children's childhood as much as possible from the worst of what the war contained. They knew their father was away. They knew it was because of the war. They knew some things from school and the radio and the conversations of other children that she could not entirely screen. They did not know the specific statistics she knew about casualty rates in the Pacific Theatre, which she had read in the newspaper and which she had folded away in the internal file that she maintained for things she knew and did not speak. She answered their questions honestly when asked and was economical about the answers. Their father was well. The war was going the right way. He would come home when the war was over. The war would be over. The children were smart. They were watching her as much as they were listening to her words. They were reading her face the way children read faces, with the unself-conscious expertise of people whose safety depends on accurately interpreting the emotional states of the adults around them. She was careful about her face. Not dishonest. She did not perform a happiness she did not feel, but she was careful not to show them the deep register of the fear, because that register, if shown, would be confirmed and amplified in the way that children amplify the emotional states of their parents. She carried the fear at a depth where it would not leak through to them in the ordinary moments, and she processed it in the dark hours when they were asleep. This is a form of strength that does not have a very good name. There is a photograph that circulated in wartime America that you may have seen. Not a specific photograph, but a type. A woman standing at the stove, back to the camera, through the kitchen window visible the small service flag with its blue star. The photograph is taken from behind, which means you cannot see her face. You see the apron strings. You see her hands, which are doing something, stirring something, tending something, working. You see the flag in the window. I have thought about that photograph many times, about what it represents and does not represent. The woman at the stove in the photograph is working, which is obvious. What is less obvious, what the photograph cannot quite capture, but what I think every woman who is in that position understands, is that the working is itself the holding on. The act of continuing to cook, to tend the stove, to do the ordinary necessary things. This is not a sign that she is not afraid. It is a sign that she is doing the only thing available to her in the face of fear that cannot be acted on directly. She cannot go to where he is. She cannot make the war stop. She cannot do anything to change the fundamental conditions of the risk he is in. She can put supper on. She can write him a letter. She can put up 412 jars of food for the family's winter. She can get up every morning and run the household with the same competence she would bring if he were here. Because if the household falls apart in his absence, it is one more thing wrong with the world, and she has decided that she is not going to be the source of additional wrongness. She is going to be the source of things remaining right. The letter is on the counter. The tea is warm. She opens it. He is well. He says so. He asks about the children by name, specific questions. He says he is thinking about the garden and whether the tomatoes did better than last year, and whether she managed to get the fence in the backyard sorted because he knows the post was going soft at the corner and he wishes he'd gotten to it before he left. She makes a note to herself to have someone look at the fence post. She will handle it. She handles everything. She reads the letter twice and folds it along its existing creases and puts it in the box in the bedroom with the others, where they sit in chronological order. The box itself a kind of chronology, a record of the weeks he's been gone told in paper and ink. She goes back to the kitchen. Supper is not going to make itself. Let me tell you about the particular quality of waiting that was the specific emotional experience of the wartime home front, because it is one of the things most difficult to convey to people who did not live through it, and one of the things that shaped these women's lives most profoundly. The waiting was not passive, it was one of the most active states she inhabited. She waited for the mail. Every day the mailman came between 11 and 11:30, and she was rarely at the window when he came because being at the window felt like a kind of surrender to the anxiety that she was managing. But she was aware of the time in the particular way of someone who is tracking something without admitting to themselves that they are tracking it. And when she heard the sound of the mail slot, the particular sound it made when letters fell through, different from when only circulars came, she finished whatever she was in the middle of before going to collect it, because finishing the task was a practice in managing the urgency, in not letting the anxiety run the household. She waited for the evening news. The radio came on at 6, the news at 6 and again at 9, and she organised her work around those times not because she needed to stop what she was doing to listen, but because the news was the update on the conditions under which her husband was serving and she needed to hear it. She listened while she cooked supper. She listened while she mended. She was always doing something while she listened, because the act of doing something while the news played was a way of maintaining the relationship between the news and the ordinary life she was sustaining, a way of refusing to let the news be the whole of the evening. She waited for the signs that were not letters, the absence of a telegram, which was the form in which the government notified families of casualties, which she scanned for with an attention that she kept strictly below the level of consciousness, because to allow it into consciousness would have been to allow the terror it represented into consciousness, and she was not willing to do that. The telegram service delivered at any hour. She had seen what a telegram looked like when it arrived, the yellow envelope, the Western Union messenger, the knock on the door at any time of day or night. She had seen it happen to the Hendersons. She knew what it meant when she saw it. She did not allow herself to imagine the knock on her own door. This was a discipline of the imagination she had developed and maintained over 2 years, not a denial of the possibility, but a refusal to rehearse it, because rehearsing it was both emotionally destructive and practically useless. Nothing she imagined would change what happened. The only thing within her control was the quality of the days she was living, and she chose to live them in a way that was not organised around the worst thing that could happen. This is called resilience in the clinical literature, and courage in the literature of heroism and sanity in the literature of ordinary life, and she would not have used any of those words for it. She would have said she had no choice, which is not quite true but is what it felt like from the inside, the way that maintaining equanimity in the face of uncertainty can feel like not having options, when it is actually the most difficult and most deliberate option available. She did have a practice for the worst of the fear that she did not discuss with anyone, and that surfaced in the hours when the house was quiet and the children were asleep. She went to the garden. Even in the evenings, even in the dark of October, she went out to the backyard and she stood among the garden beds and she let the garden be what it was. A thing she had made, a thing that was growing, a thing that would be there in the spring and the spring after that, a thing that had a future that she was contributing to. The garden was her evidence that the future existed, that she was planting for it, that she had reasonable expectation of it. She stood in the dark backyard in October, the soil cold under her shoes, the bare cornstalk still standing, the late kale still green, the last of the chard hanging on, and she breathed, and the fear receded to the level where she could carry it, which was not the level of its absence but the level of its management. And then she went inside and checked the children and went to bed. The V-mail letters he sent were photographed at the source, and reduced to approximately a quarter of their original size when they arrived. She learned to read his handwriting at this reduced scale because she had no choice, but she noted carefully which letters came as originals, the full sheets of paper he had touched, his own handwriting at its original size, the folds in the paper where he had folded them to fit the envelope, and these she handled differently from the V-mail reproductions. She held them longer. She put them face down on the table and then face up again, as if the different angle might reveal something she had missed. It never did. The letter said what it said, but the paper was real, the same physical object his hands had touched, and this meant something that logic could not fully account for, and that she did not try to account for. It simply meant something. She kept every letter. The box in which she kept them grew heavier through the years of his absence, accumulating the weekly instalments of his continued existence, the record of the distance and the time and the strangeness of this period, kept because discarding a letter was something she could not imagine doing even when the drawer was getting full. When he came home and the letters stopped coming, because the letter-writing habit ceased as naturally as it had begun, replaced by the presents that made letters unnecessary. She put the box in the closet on the high shelf. She never sorted through it again. Not because the letters were painful to read, though some of them were, but because the box itself was the record of the waiting, and the waiting was over, and the record of it belonged on the high shelf, present but not consulted, kept but not revisited. Years later, when the children were grown and the house was being sorted for a move, the box came down from the shelf. Her daughter opened it and read the letters, sitting on the floor of the emptying bedroom, reading in the particular silence of someone reading something very old and very personal that was not meant for their eyes, but to which their eyes are welcome now. She came to tell her mother what she had found in the letters, thinking she might not know what they contained. Her mother smiled and said she knew, and then she said something that her daughter remembered for the rest of her life, something that this story has been building toward without naming it until now. She said, "I knew he would come back because I behaved as if he would, that is all. I behaved as if he would every day until he did." There was a photograph she had taken from the newspaper and put on the refrigerator door with a magnet in the spring of 1943. Not the gruesome photographs, those she did not clip, but a photograph of something else, something she had decided she needed to see every day. It was a photograph of a garden in England, a victory garden in a public park in London, some park she did not recognise, the beds neat and the vegetables clearly thriving in the English summer, and in the background a wall of sandbags and beyond that a building whose upper floors showed the gap-toothed evidence of bomb damage. The garden was flourishing in front of the damaged building. She had put it on the refrigerator because it said something she needed said every day, something about the relationship between the ordinary work of keeping things growing and the larger context of everything. The garden continuing, the work continuing, the ordinary acts of tending and growing and harvesting continuing in the presence of damage and threat. She was not a dramatically symbolic person. She did not think in terms of symbols generally, but this photograph was telling her something true, and she needed the reminder of it. The ordinary work is the resistance. This was not a phrase she would have used. It is a phrase I am attaching to a practice she maintained without naming it. But the practice was real. The daily continuation of the household's life is a statement of refusal to be entirely defined by the circumstances. The meals on the table and the jars on the shelf and the letters in the box and the floor waxed and the children in school and the railing on the basement stairs. All of it continuing, all of it persisting. The ordinary work is the thing that holds the world together while the larger events resolve. She took the photograph down in October of 1945, not because it had stopped being true, but because it had done its work. She did not need the reminder anymore. He was home. The particular urgency of that daily reminder had passed. She put it in a drawer. She kept it for the rest of her life. She did not look at it again. She knew what it contained. The small one has decided she will not eat her carrots. This is announced at the dinner table on a Tuesday in February with the calm certainty of a person who has considered the situation carefully and arrived at a firm position. The carrots are on her plate. She's not going to eat them. This is not a temporary condition. It is a permanent stance. She looks at her daughter across the table. She looks at the carrots. She notes that the carrots are the carrots from her own jars, put up in September from the garden she tended through the summer, that they are perfectly cooked, that they represent the work of multiple days from planting through harvesting through canning, and that her daughter is 4 years old and has not considered any of this. She says, "You do not have to eat all of them." She holds up 2 fingers, 2 bites. Her daughter looks at her, looks at the carrots, looks at her again. 2 bites are negotiated down to 1.5, which is philosophically incoherent but practically achievable, and the dinner continues. This is what most of parenthood looks like. Not the dramatic moments, not the crises, not the things that make it into stories. The ongoing low-stakes negotiation of daily life with small people who are testing the boundaries of everything simultaneously while you are simultaneously managing a household and a war and a grocery budget, and the emotional weight of a husband overseas, and the general existential weight of 1943. She was patient with her children. I say this not as a compliment. Patience is one of those virtues that sounds passive, but is actually a practice, an active, ongoing choice, a skill that requires effort and attention, and that, like all skills, degrades when you're exhausted or afraid or have been awake since 5 in the morning. I say it because her patience with the children was one of the things that the war had made harder, and that she had doubled down on precisely because the war had made it harder. The children needed her to be steady. They were getting their information about the world primarily from her, and the information they needed was not factual. They were getting the facts from school and the radio, but emotional. Was this going to be okay? Was the family going to be okay? Was there an adult in charge who was not afraid, or at least not visibly afraid, who was managing the situation with the particular confidence that makes children feel safe? She was that adult. She had decided to be that adult. Creativity without resources is one of those phrases that sounds like a platitude until you have actually had to practice it, at which point it becomes something more like a description of a specific skill set. She was creative without resources. She had to be. Christmas of 1942, the first Christmas of the war, had established the template. The toy supply had tightened considerably, the toy manufacturers had converted significant portions of their production to military materials, and the supply of metal toys had dropped sharply. She had made presents. She had sewed a cloth doll for her daughter with a face embroidered in thread and hair made from yarn, dressed in scraps of the yellow fabric from the curtain remnants she had kept. For the older child, she had made a set of wooden blocks from a piece of lumber she had asked the neighbour, Mr. Kelsey, to cut for her on his workshop saw, sanded smooth and painted in the primary colours that the child liked. For a small present, a bag of marbles purchased at the 5 and dime wrapped in tissue paper. She had also found, at a church bazaar in November, a second-hand picture book that was in good condition, the kind of thing that in peacetime she would not have given as a present, but that in 1942 was genuinely a find, and she had cleaned the cover and repaired the spine with a thin strip of fabric glued down the inside, and it was as good as new or nearly, and the child did not know or care whether it was used. This kind of resourcefulness, the capacity to look at a remnant of yellow curtain fabric and see a doll's dress, to look at a scrap of lumber and see a toy, was not a special gift that she had been born with. It was a skill she had developed through practice and necessity, the same way she had developed the skill of making a week's meals from a constrained set of ingredients, by doing it repeatedly until the constraint became the condition of the creativity rather than its obstacle. I want to talk about the school year, specifically about the role she played in the education that happened outside the classroom. The schools were managing. The schools, like every institution in 1943, were operating under conditions that peacetime had not prepared them for. Some teachers had gone to serve, others had gone to work in defence industries where the wages were considerably better, the supply of some materials was constrained, the emotional weight of children whose fathers or brothers or neighbours' fathers were at war pervaded the classroom in ways that the curriculum was not designed to address. She supplemented. This was not unusual. It was the norm for mothers in that era, and particularly in that moment. The homework was done at the kitchen table, and she sat with the older children while they did it, available for questions, which is not the same as doing the work for them, which she would not, but available, present, tracking the progress of what they were learning and where they were having trouble. The multiplication tables. She drilled the multiplication tables in the car on the way to... No, there was no car on those trips, or the car was rationed too carefully to be used casually. She drilled the multiplication tables on the walk to and from school on the day she walked with them. She asked questions as they walked, and the child answered, and the walking continued. The 9 times table was the hard one. She still knew years later that the 9 times table was the hard one, that 7 times 9 was the particular stumbling block, that they had walked the same block 4 times one afternoon working on 7 times 9. 7 times 9 is 63. The child got it eventually. These are the kinds of things that stay with you. She read to them at night. This is a practice that in 1943 was not unusual among families with books, though not every family had books, and the ones they had were the books they had accumulated over years rather than purchased new. The public library was an important institution in her life and in the lives of her children. They went to the library on Saturdays and came home with the limit allowed per card, which was 3 books per visit, and these books were read and returned and replaced with 3 more the following Saturday. She read to the younger ones from picture books and simple story collections, the ones that were soothing and funny in the way that the best children's books are both of those things at once. She read to the older one from chapter books, 1 chapter per evening after the younger children were in bed, which meant that the chapter book reading was not just reading, but a kind of special privilege, a promotion into a shared experience that the younger ones would eventually earn. This was deliberate. The management of sibling dynamics in a household with multiple children of different ages is a constant low-level project, and the chapter book reading was one of several small levers she had identified that created a structure of progression and reward without requiring constant arbitration. I find myself wanting to name something about how she held the emotional centre of the household during those years, something that is easy to see in retrospect, but that, in the moment, would have looked simply like ordinary life. She held it by being consistent, by not having a bad day that leaked into the children's day, by not taking the fear and the tiredness and the weight of the management onto the people she was managing, by maintaining the rituals, supper at the same time, bedtime at the same time, the chapter book reading on weeknights, the Sunday drive or walk, that happened even when she did not feel like it because the children needed the week to have a shape and the shape included Sunday. She held it by knowing her children specifically, not generically, by knowing which one needed more time to transition between activities, by knowing which one needed silence when she was upset and which one needed to talk, by knowing that one child's reluctance at bedtime was genuine overtiredness, expressing itself as resistance and needed patience, and that another child's reluctance was a bid for extended presence that needed a specific kind of acknowledgement before it would resolve. She held it by continuing to hold it when it was hard. This sounds obvious and is not. There are times when the thing that takes the most effort is simply not stopping, not putting down what you've been carrying, not admitting to the exhaustion that would be reasonable to admit. She did not put it down. She carried it with a steadiness that looked, from the outside, like ease, because that is what steadiness looks like from the outside. The children did not, in those years, fully appreciate what she was doing for them. They were children. They were not equipped to appreciate it yet. What they received from her was not appreciation, but something more fundamental. The foundational sense of security that makes it possible to grow, the knowledge, absorbed at a cellular level rather than articulated, that there was an adult who was reliably there and capable of managing what needed to be managed. They would appreciate it later. Many of them, the children of 1943, would spend the rest of their lives trying to articulate what their mothers had given them in those years, and many of them would not quite find the words, because the gift was not made of words. It was made of meals and routines and steady presence, of being carried through a difficult time by someone who never suggested that the being carried was a burden. She reads a chapter, the lamp makes a warm circle, outside the winter street is quiet. She finishes the chapter at the good stopping place, the natural pause, the moment of sufficient resolution that allows rest without abandoning the story. She closes the book, she tucks the child in, she kisses her forehead. She turns off the lamp. She goes back to the kitchen to finish the dishes. The children of that household learned things in those years that could not be put on a curriculum and were not listed as learning objectives anywhere. They learned that adults can be afraid and continue to function. This is a thing that children who grow up with parents who are consistently honest, without being consistently distressed, absorb rather than learn explicitly. They observe it, they internalize it, they carry it forward as a template for how an adult is supposed to behave under pressure. She was afraid sometimes. Not always. There were weeks when the news was good and the letters were regular, and the fear receded to a low-level background hum that she managed without difficulty. But there were other weeks, and the children were smart enough to feel the difference in the air of the house, the slightly different quality of her attention, the slightly greater deliberateness of the cheerfulness she maintained. They did not name it. She did not name it. They all understood that something was present and was being managed, and that part of their job in the household was to not increase the burden of the management by needing things they could manage without. The older child, who was 9 and then 10 and then 11 through those war years, took on responsibilities that previous generations would have been unremarkable to assign, and that contemporary parenting would discuss more carefully. She helped with the younger child. She helped with tasks that were within her physical capacity, setting and clearing the table, drying and putting away the dishes she was tall enough to reach, carrying the laundry basket to the basement, helping in the garden with the tasks that required persistence more than strength. She did not do these things because she was coerced. She did them because she understood, in the way that children in close-knit households understand without being told that the household was a shared project and that her contribution to it was expected and valuable. This understanding that you are part of something larger than yourself and that you have obligations to it was one of the most important things her mother gave her, and she would carry it forward in her own household and try, with varying success, to give it to her own children. The younger child was still small enough in those years to experience the household circumstances primarily through texture rather than meaning. She knew that Daddy was away. She knew that the presence of the radio news was accompanied by a particular quality of her mother's attention. She knew that the gold star in the window down the street was associated with a change in the mood of the block. She did not know what any of these things meant in the larger sense. She was 4, and 4 is too young for the larger sense. What she received from those years, what the woman who ran the household gave her in those years, was the particular texture of safety, warmth at the right time, food at the right time, attention at the right time, the reliable presence of an adult who was in charge and who was not visibly overwhelmed. She would not remember the specific days. She would not remember the meals or the routines or the particular sound of the news on the radio. She would remember something that is not possible to articulate precisely, something like the foundation below memory, the quality of having been securely held. This is the gift that the daily work of the household, the cooking and the cleaning and the planning and the managing, was ultimately in service of. Not the clean floor or the labelled jars or the ironed shirts. Those were the means. The end was this: children who grew up feeling held, feeling that the world they inhabited was managed by someone who was equal to it, feeling that there was a floor under them that would not give way. She gave them that floor. She built it from the daily work and the steadiness and the patience and the planning and the cooking and the gardening and the mending and the letter writing and the fear management and the management of everything, every day, without a day off and without complaint and without anyone noticing that it was being done and without any expectation that it would be noticed. She built it and it held. It holds still in the people they became, in the way they parent their own children, in the quality of presence they are able to bring to difficult moments, because they were taught by example that difficult moments do not require you to stop functioning, that the beans can still be put on, and the letter can still be written, and the floor can still be waxed, and the children can still be fed, even when the world is genuinely frightening and the future is genuinely uncertain. The most important things she taught them she never put into words. They were not put into words because they were lived daily in the visible record of her management of everything. Parenthood at its best is like that. The lesson is not the thing you say. The lesson is the thing you do, day after day, in the ordinary and unglamorous and unacknowledged hours when no one is watching, and the only witness to your effort is the effort itself. She taught them how to wait without despairing, how to plan without rigidity, how to make the best of what is available without pretending that what is available is ideal, how to feel fear without being ruled by it, how to keep the ordinary things going in the middle of the extraordinary. These are not small things to know, they are in fact the most important things. By 8 o'clock, the kitchen is done. Done in the particular sense that a kitchen is done at the end of a long day, not spotless, not restored to some ideal original condition, but finished. The dishes washed and draining, the counters wiped, the table cleared and cleaned, the pot on the back of the stove with the lid on, whatever is left from supper still warm in case anyone wants it later, which no one will. The dish towel folded over the oven handle, as it always is, a small habitual act of order that she has done so many times it happens without thought. She pours herself a cup of tea. Not coffee. Coffee is rationed and the day's allocation is finished. Tea, which is not rationed, which she has begun to drink in the evenings as a small wartime adaptation that has turned out to suit her. She has discovered over these 2 years that she prefers tea in the evenings to the coffee she would have had before. This is the kind of thing that emerges from constraint. You try something you would not otherwise have tried, and it turns out to suit you. She has catalogued a number of small discoveries of this kind. The oleo in certain applications is actually better. The bread made entirely from whole wheat flour has a nuttiness she prefers to white. The meatless Tuesdays that the government encouraged have produced from necessity some meals she intends to keep making after the war. She takes the tea to the living room. The radio's already on, warming up, the dial glowing amber in the dark room. She turns on the lamp by the armchair, just the one lamp, the habit of conservation that has become her habit, regardless of whether economy requires it, and she sits down. She takes the mending basket from beside the chair and sets it on her lap. The mending basket. I want to spend a little time with the mending basket because it is one of those objects that tells a disproportionately complete story about the life it is embedded in. In 1943, clothing was not cheap relative to income, and the supply of certain goods was constrained by wartime production priorities. The L-85 regulations, issued by the War Production Board in 1942, limited the amount of fabric that could be used in a garment, which meant that the new clothes available were already economized, already cut to use less material, and that making them last was therefore doubly important. But even without the regulations, the culture of the era was not a culture of disposability. Clothes were mended because mending was cheaper and more respectful than replacement, because fabric was valuable, because the labour of the original making had been real and the product of it deserved to be maintained. Her mending basket contained her husband's socks, which she darned on a wooden darning egg, the heel rebuilt stitch by stitch over the hole where his heel had worn through, her daughter's dress, where the seam at the shoulder had come loose and needed to be resewn, a pair of the older child's trousers, where the pocket had pulled away from the waistband, her own sweater, where the elbow was thinning and she was reinforcing it before the thinning became a hole. She mended by radio light and lamplight, her hands doing a job that her hands knew well enough not to require much of her attention, and the radio played. Jack Benny on Sunday, Fibber McGee and Molly, which made her laugh every time Molly tried to stop Fibber from opening the hall closet, even though she knew exactly what was going to happen, and it happened every episode. The avalanche of junk, the sound effects of everything falling, the resigned acknowledgement. The humour of those programmes is so specific to their moment that it is almost untranslatable, but I want to try to describe it because it captures something real about how the culture of those years handled difficulty. The humour was not dark, it was not bitter, it was warm and domestic and based in the ordinary frustrations of ordinary life, the tight budgets, the small absurdities, the persistent gap between aspiration and reality. It was humour that said, "This is hard, and we know it is hard, and we're choosing to laugh about it because that is also a form of endurance." She laughed at Fibber's closet every time. The news came on at 9. She listened. There was a discipline to the way she listened to the war news that she had developed over 2 years of this practice, a skill of hearing accurately without catastrophizing, of taking in what was reported without letting the worst interpretation metastasize into the fear that was always available if you let it. The news was what it was. She listened. She translated it into what she understood about where he was and what it might mean for him, without arriving at conclusions she could not verify, and without allowing the unverifiable to become the thing she was living inside. Some nights the news was genuinely good. The tide was turning in ways that anyone paying attention could see by 1943, the North Africa campaign coming to its conclusion, the Allies established, the long grind toward the Pacific inevitable if not fast. She held these things as evidence of the outcome she was working toward, and they helped. Some nights the news was harder. She listened and she made a small notation of what she had heard, and she sat with it for a moment without running from it, and then she picked up the mending. The mending was always there. I want to say something about this particular form of evening rest, the mending by radio light, because I think it captures something that has mostly left modern life, and that I am not sure we have found an adequate replacement for. The particular quality of attention that mending requires, the light, engaged, tracking attention of hands working on something familiar while the mind is available for something else, is one of those states that modern life does not produce easily. The work is real but not demanding. The production is real but not pressured. The mind is available but not performing. You are present and you are also elsewhere. You're in the living room and you're also, slightly, inside the radio program, inside whatever your thoughts are running. This is not the same as watching television. I want to be specific about this because I think the difference matters. Watching television is a primarily receptive act. The content comes toward you and you receive it. Mending while listening to the radio is a different kind of dual occupation because one of the two activities is generative. You're making something. The stitch is being laid in by your hands. The zoc is being rebuilt. Something in the world is being made more whole by what you're doing, and this is happening at the same time as the radio is filling the room with sound. The combination produces something I would call contented, usefully occupied presence, which I do not know of a shorter way to name. It is not the absence of worry. She had plenty to worry about. It is the presence of a kind of grounded continuity, the knowledge that the hands are busy with something real while the rest of her rests. By 9:30, the mending basket is a little lighter. One sock is done. The shoulder seam on her daughter's dress is mended. The radio is playing music now, the hour after the programs when the networks fill the time with the big band sounds that are everywhere in those years. Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman and Tommy Dorsey, the particular energy of the mid-century American sound, brass and swing and rhythm that carries so much of the era's emotional content, the optimism and the sadness and the desire and the loneliness all present simultaneously in the music in a way that you can feel if you know what you are listening for. She writes the letter. This is part of the evening too. The letter to him, which she writes at the desk in the corner of the living room on the airmail stationery she keeps in the small drawer. She writes to him about the day, in the particular register that she's developed for these letters over 2 years, which is honest but not burdening, warm but not falsely cheerful, detailed enough to convey the texture of the life he is missing, but not weighted with the specific anxieties that would not help him. She writes about the small one and the carrots. She writes about the chapter book reading, the plot of the chapter they are on, the child's theory about what will happen next. She writes about the garden plans she's already beginning to think about for spring. She writes about the Red Cross meeting, something funny that happened, something Mrs. Kowalski said. She does not write about the gold star in the Hendersons' window. He will know eventually when he comes home, and knowing it now serves no purpose. She writes, at the end, I think about you at breakfast when I have the first cup of coffee, and at supper when the children are loud and it is a little overwhelming, and when I go to bed and the other side is empty. I am keeping everything together here. I need you to know that. Everything is taken care of. She seals the letter. She will mail it tomorrow. The radio plays a slow song she recognizes, something with a clarinet, something that has the particular ache of music made in the middle of a long separation. She sits with it for a moment without mending, without the letter, without anything in her hands. This is the rest she allows herself, this specific song, these specific minutes. And then the mending basket goes back beside the chair. The lamp goes off. The radio dial fades as the set cools. She carries the teacup to the kitchen, rinses it, sets it in the drying rack. Folds the dish towel over the oven handle. Checks the back burner. Turns off the kitchen light. The house settles around her. The particular sounds of a house at rest. The furnace cycling, the pipes, the wind finding the gap at the kitchen window she has left, cracked because she likes to hear the night. These sounds are the sound of the house itself, the house she has been running alone for 2 years, the house that is hers in a way that it was not entirely hers before he left. She is tired. She is genuinely, deeply, specifically tired in a way that is different from the tiredness of a day of ordinary effort. She is tired in the way that people who have been holding things up for a long time are tired, the tiredness that lives in the muscles of the will rather than in the body alone. She goes to bed. She does not check the lock. She has already checked the lock, but she listens for a moment in the doorway to the children's rooms. The particular breathing of sleeping children is one of the most specific sounds in the world, and she knows the particular breathing of these specific children, the rhythm of each, the sound of their absolute trust in the safety of this house and this night. She has made this house safe for them. She has held it together. She has done the work. She goes to her room. The bed is a double, and the other side is flat and uninhabited, and she has been not noticing this for 2 years. She lies down. She does not read. The day has been long enough that the body's need is not for stimulation but for release, and she gives herself the permission of it, turning off the lamp and letting the dark be darkened, letting the thoughts settle like sediment in still water, not stopping but slowing, losing their urgency, becoming the background instead of the foreground. She thinks about the letter on the counter that she will mail tomorrow. She thinks about the fence post that needs to be looked at. She thinks about the spring garden plan, the early peas, whether to try a new variety of tomato this year. She thinks about him. She thinks about the particular sound of his voice saying her name, which is a thing she has memorized and which she plays for herself sometimes in the dark before sleep, the way you play a piece of music you know by heart. The furnace cycles, the house is warm. She sleeps. The evening had its rituals, and rituals matter because they provide the scaffolding on which a life can hold itself upright when the conditions are difficult. She was not someone who used words like ritual or self-care or intentional practice. She would have said she just did the same things every evening because they needed doing, and because having a routine made the evenings manageable. This is accurate, and it understates the significance. A routine that holds a household together through a period of sustained difficulty is not merely a convenience, it is a form of architecture. After the dishes were done and the children were in bed and the mending basket had been worked through for the evening, she had approximately an hour before the fatigue of the day required sleep. She used this hour differently on different nights, and the variation itself was important. The evening was not a rigid sequence but a flexible one, organised around certain fixed points and allowing for weather. On Sunday evenings the radio was Jack Benny, and the Jack Benny programme was a social event in the same way that church was a social event, the shared experience of a cultural institution that millions of Americans were participating in simultaneously, on their own radios in their own living rooms, laughing at the same jokes at the same moment across the breadth of the country. There is something about that form of shared experience, not physically together but temporally synchronized, that is genuinely remarkable, and that the television later replaced but did not quite replicate, because television brought the visual and lost something of the intimacy of the voices in the dark. She laughed at Jack Benny. She laughed genuinely, not performed, not the polite acknowledgement of humour but the real thing, and the laugh in the quiet living room was one of the ways she let herself be not managing, not calculating, not holding everything together, just a woman in a chair laughing at a joke. Laughter is not a small thing. Especially during the war years, laughter was a significant act of survival, a refusal to be entirely defined by the weight of the circumstances. The programs that made people laugh during those years, the situation comedies, and the variety shows and the radio dramas with their light-touched humour, served a function that was not merely entertainment. They provided a regular scheduled moment of reprieve, a guaranteed space in the week where the mood would lift and the face would relax and the body would respond to the pleasure of the absurd. She gave herself this. She chose it as a use of her evening hours. On other evenings, after the mending and the letter, she read. She had always been a reader. The public library had been her resource since childhood, and in the years of her husband's absence she had used it more than she had in the busy domestic years before the war, going on Saturday mornings with the children and coming back with her own 3 books as well as theirs, selecting with the same kind of careful practicality she brought to the grocery store. What will give me the most value from the investment of my reading time? She read novels. This is worth noting because there is a tendency in recounting the lives of women of this period to emphasize their practical activities, the cooking, the canning, the rationing, and to overlook the inner life, the life of the mind that was running alongside the domestic work, that read novels and thought about them and had opinions about them and was shaped by them. She was reading the novels of the 1940s, the books that people were reading, and they were affecting her the way good books affect people, changing the way she saw things, giving her language for experiences she had not had words for, connecting her to a world of imagination that was not the kitchen, and not the garden, and not the rationing, but was also real. She read John Steinbeck, whose The Grapes of Wrath she had read before the war, and whose work she continued to follow. She read Willa Cather, whose novels about women on the plains resonated with something in her own experience of endurance and of the land. She read the mystery novels that were popular in those years, Agatha Christie, Ellery Queen, not as serious literature but as the pleasure of a problem to be solved, the satisfying resolution of a mystery that the everyday presented in forms that did not resolve as cleanly. She read the magazines, Life magazine, with its extraordinary photographs from the war theatres, the images that were both essential and very hard to look at, that she looked at because she felt she owed it to the people in the photographs to witness what they were going through, and that she sometimes put down midway through because there was a limit to what she could witness in an evening, and then sleep. Ladies' Home Journal, which during the war years transformed its content from the domestic and the decorative to the practical and the civic, the Victory Garden coverage and the rationing recipes and the acknowledgement that the women reading it were managing something significant and deserved to be addressed as people with serious responsibilities. The magazines also contained advertisements, and the advertisements are one of those fascinating documentary artifacts of the period, the advertising industry in real time navigating the tension between wartime scarcity and the need to maintain consumer desire for the post-war market, reassuring women that the products they could not currently have, the nylon stockings, the new appliances, the materials and luxuries that had been redirected to the war effort, would be available again when the war was over and would be better than before and were worth waiting for. She read these advertisements with the partial attention you give to something you recognise as persuasion, noting them, taking from them what was useful, the occasional recipe or household tip embedded in the copy, the sometimes genuine information about wartime substitutes and practices, and setting aside the aspiration. The aspiration was for later, now was for managing now. She put the magazine down when the programme ended. She stood up from the chair, the mending basket lighter than it had been at the start of the evening, the letter sealed on the end table. The kitchen, one last time. The pot on the back burner checked, the burner off, the stovetop wiped, the dish towel refolded, the window checked, the light off. She stood in the doorway of each child's room for a moment before she went to bed. Not going in, not risking the disruption, just standing, listening to the breathing, letting the sound of it tell her what it told her every night. That they were here, that they were well, that this specific thing was all right. All right tonight. Which was enough. She went to bed. The bedroom was dark and the bed was large and the other side was empty, and she lay on her side and closed her eyes and let the day go. The day had been long. The day had been full. The day had been an ordinary day of the life she was living in 1943, which was the life of a woman running a household alone in the middle of a war, which was not ordinary in any larger sense, but which had been normalized by repetition into a texture that she inhabited with the full specificity of someone who knows their life completely. She thought about the tomatoes. She'd noticed this morning that the last of the beefsteaks in the second row were close to ready, maybe 2 more days, and she should plan a canning run for Thursday. She would need to check the jar supply. She thought she had enough quarts, but she should check. She thought about the children's school picture day next week and whether she had remembered to return the form. She had remembered. She thought about him. She played the sound of his voice saying her name, the specific intonation, the way he said it when he was tired and glad to be home. She played it carefully, like a piece of music she was trying to memorize from a single hearing, preserving it against the possibility of forgetting. She fell asleep before she had finished playing it. The furnace ran. The house was warm. The maple tree stood in the backyard, invisible in the dark, its branches bare and patient, carrying everything it had been through in its rings. The evening radio deserves more time because the radio was not background in those years. It was foreground, and what it carried into the living room was both entertainment and the world. She listened to the news with a specific quality of attention that I've been trying to describe accurately without resorting to the word vigilant, which has the wrong connotation, too high alert, too martial. It was not vigilant. It was attentive. It was the attention of someone who is receiving information that matters and who wants to receive it accurately. The news of those years, heard on a small radio in a living room in the middle of America, had a quality of compression that print did not. The voices of the correspondents, some of them broadcasting from London or from the Pacific, the static that often accompanied them, the sense of distance being bridged by technology, the war arriving into the living room through the cloth grill of the console. Edward R. Murrow broadcasting from London during the Blitz. She had listened to those broadcasts in 1940, before the US entered the war, listening with a particular mixture of horror and absorption that distance provides, the safe distance of a neutral country from which the war was being observed. And then after Pearl Harbor, the distance disappeared, and the broadcasts were no longer the news of someone else's war, but the news of a war that her husband would eventually serve in. She listened to Murrow. She listened to the other correspondents whose voices she came to know over those years. She trusted the ones whose voices carried what she thought of as weight, not gravity or solemnity, but the specific quality of a person speaking carefully because they understood that what they were saying mattered. Between the news programs and the entertainment, the radio played music. The music of the 1940s is one of those bodies of work that carries enormous emotional weight for the people who heard it in context, during the war years, and that carries a different weight entirely for people who encounter it afterward. She heard it in context. The Glenn Miller sound, the particular voicing of the brass, the clarinet lead above the saxophones, the rhythm that made you want to move. This was the sound of the years before and during the war, before the disappearance over the Channel, and afterward the sound of those years, the emotional signature of a particular historical moment. She danced to Glenn Miller records at a USO dance in December 1941 before he left. The dance was a specific memory. The hall, the smell of coffee and someone's perfume, the way the music organised the room. She danced by herself in the kitchen occasionally, when a song she liked came on the radio and the children were in bed and she was putting things away. Just a few steps, just the pleasure of the movement, the physical response to a sound she loved. She would not have called this anything. She would have said she was just moving around the kitchen while putting things away. But it was also rest. It was also care for herself. The small permitted pleasure of music in the kitchen, alone, moving for the pleasure of moving. This is what self-care looks like before the phrase existed. The cup of tea at the end of the evening, the chapter of the novel, the few steps in the kitchen when the music was right. Small, unannounced, real. The kitchen is quiet now. It is early, earlier than anyone needs to be awake. The pale grey of before dawn at the windows, the particular light that belongs to no hour, the hour before the hour. The coffee is on. She put it on first, before anything, as she has always done, as she will always do, the smell of it reaching every room of the house with the same certainty as the heat from a good fire. She stands at the window. The maple tree is bare in February, the branches against the pale sky making the delicate, complicated pattern that bare branches make. Every branch visible now that the leaves are gone, the whole architecture of the thing revealed. You can see its structure most clearly when it is stripped down, when what remains is just the shape of the growth itself, the record of all the years since she planted it. She thinks about something her mother used to say, that the things you make and the things you tend are the autobiography you do not write down. The kitchen around her is the autobiography of the years she has lived in it. The cast iron skillet on the back burner, seasoned dark and smooth from thousands of uses, which she has kept and maintained and passed along. It is already, she has decided, for the older daughter, whenever the time comes for that kind of passing. The canning jars on the pantry shelves, this year's label in her handwriting, this year's summer preserved. The Singer sewing machine in the corner, which had been her mother's and which her daughter is already learning. The dish towel folded over the oven handle. The window with the yellow curtain that she made from fabric bought at the 5 and dime many years ago now, the colour faded from the washing but still warm in the morning light. The small stain on the ceiling where the upstairs pipe had a slow leak 3 winters ago, and she had managed the repair and painted over the stain herself in the end, because waiting for someone else to do it is not her way, and has not been her way for a long time. The row of cookbooks on the shelf above the counter, the joy of cooking she bought used at the church sale in 1940. The pamphlets from the extension service that she cannot bring herself to throw away because some of the recipes in them are ones she still uses, the handwritten recipe cards in the little box that she added to over the years, and that constitute something like a history of the family's eating. The coffee percolates. She pours a cup, stands at the window with both hands around it, looking at the maple tree, looking at the backyard where the garden beds are covered with straw for the winter, where under the straw the soil is resting, holding everything that was put into it over the years, ready for spring. She thinks about the letter she wrote to him last night, 30 years ago, that said, "Everything is taken care of." She thinks about all the mornings she stood here before anyone else was awake, running the calculation of the day. She thinks about 412 jars. Outside, the sky at the eastern edge of the garden is lightening. Not yet dawn, but the suggestion of it, the world's daily reassurance that the dark is temporary. The house is quiet around her. Somewhere upstairs, someone sleeping. The furnace cycles on and the heat rises through the floors. The maple tree stands in the backyard, bare and patient, its full architecture visible. She stands in the kitchen she knows by feel, in the house she's made and maintained and run for more years than she can easily count, and she lets the quiet be quiet. The coffee is warm. The morning is here. Everything's taken care of. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. Did your grandmother or great-grandmother live through the 1940s homefront? Is there something she made or something she said that you still carry with you? I would genuinely love to hear it in the comments. She is in the kitchen, and the coffee is on, and the light through the window is the first light of the day, and the house is quiet. This is the moment as it has always been, before the day has begun and after the night has ended. The threshold. She's not in 1943 now, she's decades later. The gas range has been replaced once. The children are grown and have their own kitchens and their own gardens. The ration books are in a box somewhere, kept without reason and without the intention to look at them, kept because you do not throw away the things that mark what you came through. The maple tree is larger than her now by many times. It has had hard winters and good winters. It has been pruned once by a man with a truck and a chainsaw who came to remove the branch that had grown too close to the house. It has been reshaped by wind and by the weight of ice in certain winters. It is still standing. She planted it from a sapling she carried home on a bus 40 years ago, with a small canvas bag of potting soil on the seat beside her. This is the autobiography she wrote. The tree, the floor, the pantry, the 412 jars, the ironed shirts, the letters, the railing on the basement stairs, the children, grown, the grandchildren, visiting. This is what she made. Not from talent, not from resources, not from any advantage that was given to her. From time and attention and the willingness to do the work that was in front of her every day, for as long as the work required doing. The coffee is on. The morning light comes through the yellow curtain, a different yellow curtain, the third in this kitchen, and makes its particular pattern on the floor. The cast iron skillet is on the back burner. The pantry has what it needs. She pours her coffee, both hands around the cup. She looks at the maple tree. She thinks about none of this. She just stands at the window and drinks her coffee and looks at the tree. This is enough. This is exactly enough. Whatever this morning needs from her, she will do. She always has. The coffee is warm. The morning is here. She is here. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one.